Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 700 years to a time when the air itself seemed poisoned and death knocked on every door without warning. Imagine yourself wrapped in rough wool, your feet sore from cobblestone streets, your nostrils filled with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something sour and wrong that drifts from the house 3 doors down. You're about to live through the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. But some people did. Millions of them actually. And tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the world outside your window fades to quiet, we're going to explore exactly how they managed it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how this little community stretches across time zones, some of you just waking up, others deep in the velvet hours of night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the year 1343, give or take a few months, somewhere in the patchwork of kingdoms, duchies and city-states that make up medieval Europe. The exact location doesn't matter so much right now. Whether you're in a Florentine workshop, a Parisian market square, or a small English village surrounded by muddy fields, life has a particular rhythm that would feel both alien and strangely familiar to your modern sensibilities. The morning begins before dawn. You hear the bells first, always the bells, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the canonical hours that structure everyone's day whether they're particularly devout or not. You rise from a straw mattress that you share with at least one other person, possibly several, because privacy is a luxury that most people simply cannot afford. The room smells of bodies, of last night's fire reduced to cold ash, of the faint mustiness that clings to timber and thatch no matter how often you sweep. Breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of yesterday's bread softened in weak ale. Coffee doesn't exist in Europe yet, and tea is an exotic mystery known only to the most well-travelled merchants who ventured toward the distant east. You drink ale because the water often makes people sick, though nobody quite understands why, and even children take their morning drink with a mild alcoholic content that would raise eyebrows at any modern paediatrician's office. Outside, the streets are already alive with activity. Vendors call out their wares. A blacksmith's hammer rings against iron. Somewhere, a pig has escaped from someone's backyard enclosure and is causing a small commotion near the well. You step carefully because the streets are not paved in the modern sense, and yesterday's rain has turned everything into a treacherous soup of mud, animal waste, and whatever refuse people have tossed from their windows. The famous cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, exists precisely because chamber pots are routinely emptied into the streets below, and the unlucky pedestrian learns to walk close to the buildings at their own peril. This is a world dense with humanity in ways that might surprise you. Historians still argue whether medieval cities were truly as crowded as some accounts suggest, but the consensus points to an intimacy of living that most modern people would find claustrophobic. London, one of the larger cities in this era, houses perhaps 50,000 souls within walls originally built by Romans a millennium earlier. Paris is larger still, swelling toward 200,000. These numbers might seem modest compared to modern metropolises, but remember, there are no skyscrapers, no sprawling suburbs, no efficient transportation networks allowing people to live far from where they work. Everyone is packed together, breathing the same air, sharing the same wells, bumping shoulders in narrow lanes where 2 carts can barely pass. And yet, despite the grime and the smell and the general precariousness of existence, there is a vibrancy here that you cannot help but feel. The medieval world is not the dark, miserable wasteland that later centuries would imagine. People laugh, they gossip, they fall in love in inconvenient ways, they argue about politics and religion, and the outrageous price of candles this season. Children play games in the streets that their great-great-grandchildren will still be playing centuries from now. Merchants dream of wealth. Apprentices dream of mastery. Young people dream of romance while their parents dream of advantageous marriages. Life pulses forward with all its ordinary hopes and disappointments. The economy in this particular moment is doing reasonably well. The 13th century saw significant growth across Europe. New lands cleared for farming, new towns chartered, trade routes expanding. The great fairs of Champagne connect the wool merchants of Flanders with the silk traders of Italy. Banking families in Florence are developing sophisticated financial instruments that would make a modern economist nod in recognition. Universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna and elsewhere are training a new class of educated professionals, lawyers, doctors, theologians, who will shape the intellectual landscape for generations. Religiously, the Catholic Church dominates every aspect of life in a way that's difficult to overstate. The local parish church isn't just a place of worship. It's the community centre, the news hub, the calendar that marks births and deaths and everything in between. The great cathedrals rising across Europe represent not just faith, but civic pride, engineering ambition, and economic investment that takes generations to complete. You might be born, marry and die without ever seeing the cathedral in your city finished, and that's perfectly normal. Building for eternity requires eternal patience. But beneath this bustling surface, there are tremors that even the most optimistic observer might notice if they knew where to look. The weather has been strange lately. Too much rain in some years, not enough in others. Harvests have been unreliable, and even in good years the population has grown to a point where the old agricultural methods strain to feed everyone. Famines struck in the early part of this century with brutal efficiency, particularly the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions across northern Europe. People ate dogs, cats, and according to some accounts, each other. Survivors remember, and the memory sits uneasily beneath the current prosperity like a wound that never fully healed. You might also notice, if you're paying attention, that the roads carry more traffic these days than your grandparents would remember. Merchants travel farther, carrying goods from places most villagers will never see. Spices from India, silks from China, furs from the distant Russian steppes. This expanding web of trade brings wealth, certainly, and new ideas, and the occasional scandal when someone's daughter runs off with a smooth-talking Italian. But roads that carry silk and silver can carry other things too, things invisible, things patient, things waiting for the right moment to emerge. For now, though, you don't know any of this. You're just trying to get through your day, finish your work, maybe sneak a moment of rest before evening prayers. The sun arcs overhead in its familiar path. The bells ring their familiar hours, and somewhere far to the east, in places you've never heard of and couldn't locate on any map, something ancient and terrible is already stirring. The Black Death isn't coming, it's already on its way. But tonight, in this quiet moment before the storm, you simply breathe the cool morning air and think about what you'll have for supper. The merchant passing by with his cart of foreign goods gives you a nod. A child laughs somewhere nearby. A dog barks at absolutely nothing, as dogs have always done and always will. This is your world, fragile and vibrant, innocent of what approaches. Hold on to this moment, because soon enough everything will change. But for now, just for now, let the ordinary sounds of medieval life wash over you like a gentle tide and feel yourself settling deeper into the comfortable darkness behind your closed eyes. The bells ring again, softer now in your imagination, marking another hour past in a world that doesn't yet know how precious each hour will become. The first whispers reach you in the most mundane way possible, through gossip at the market, the kind of wild tales that travellers always seem to bring. You're examining a somewhat questionable eel at a fishmonger's stall when the merchant beside you, a weathered man who trades in Flemish wool, leans in with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing forbidden knowledge. They say, he murmurs, glancing around as though the information itself might be dangerous, that in the lands beyond Constantinople entire cities have gone silent. Not conquered, mind you, just empty. Everyone dead within weeks. You raise an eyebrow because honestly, merchants are notorious exaggerators. The man who sold you that genuine silk from Cathay last month turned out to be peddling dyed linen from Lyon. These travelling types spin stories the way spinsters spin wool, constantly, automatically, and with varying degrees of quality. But this particular rumour doesn't die the way most rumours do. Over the following weeks and months, you hear versions of it from increasingly diverse sources. A pilgrim returning from Rome speaks of alarming letters received by the Pope. A Venetian trader, normally the most sceptical of men when it comes to competitor gossip, confirms that his contacts in the Black Sea ports have gone ominously quiet. Even the local priest mentions something during a sermon, carefully, obliquely, about tribulations in the East that should remind good Christians of the fragility of earthly existence. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting Europe to China and everything in between, has been operating for over 1,000 years by this point. It's not a single road, of course, despite the romantic name. It's a vast web of paths, mountain passes, desert crossings, and sea routes that allow goods to flow across thousands of miles. Silk gives the route its name, but really, anything valuable and portable makes the journey. Spices, gems, precious metals, horses, ideas, religions, and apparently, according to these increasingly persistent stories, diseases that melt the flesh from living bodies. The Mongol Empire, which has dominated much of Asia for the past century, has actually made this trade safer and more efficient than ever before. The Pax Mongolica, as historians would later call it, means that a merchant can theoretically travel from Korea to Poland without changing political jurisdictions. Of course, theoretically, does a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Bandits, weather, and simple bad luck still claim plenty of travellers. But the point stands, goods move faster and farther than at any previous point in human history. And so do other things. The accounts filtering back along these trade routes are genuinely horrifying, even allowing for exaggeration. Travellers speak of the disease appearing suddenly in Central Asian trading posts, killing so quickly that the sick and the dead were sometimes found together, the living having perished while trying to tend their fallen companions. Towns along the route went quiet one by one, like candles snuffed by an invisible hand moving steadily westward. Historians still argue whether the plague actually originated in Central Asia, or whether it merely passed through on its way from some even more remote source. Possibly the Himalayan foothills, possibly the steppes of Mongolia, possibly somewhere else entirely. The bacterial culprit, Yersinia pestis, has been recovered from ancient graves across a vast geographic range, and pinpointing the exact moment when it transformed from an obscure regional illness into a global catastrophe remains frustratingly difficult. What's certain is that by the early 1340s, something terrible was moving along the trade routes, with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. One particularly chilling account comes from the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Black Sea. In 1346, the city found itself besieged by Mongol forces under the command of a general named Jani Beg. Sieges were nothing unusual in medieval warfare. They were practically the default mode of military operation against fortified positions. What made this one different was what happened when plague broke out among the besieging army. According to the chronicler Gabriel de Mussy, whose account is disputed but widely cited, the Mongols began catapulting the corpses of plague victims over the city walls. Whether this represents one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare, or simply a desperate army disposing of bodies while also hoping to demoralise the defenders, nobody can say for certain. Historians still argue whether the disease could actually have spread effectively through this method. Dead bodies are generally less infectious than living carriers for this particular pathogen, but the psychological impact must have been absolutely devastating regardless. The Genoese defenders, watching bloated corpses arc through the sky and crash into their streets, would have had no framework for understanding what was happening to them in epidemiological terms. What they understood was death and terror, and the urgent need to escape before whatever curse had befallen the Mongols claimed them as well. And this is where your throat tightens slightly, because you know what comes next. Those Genoese merchants fleeing the besieged city by ship carried the plague with them. They didn't know they were infected. The disease can take days to show symptoms, and during that time, a person might feel perfectly fine while harbouring the bacteria that would kill them and everyone around them. The ships sailed west across the Black Sea, heading for Constantinople and the Italian ports beyond. They carried silk and spices in their holds, yes, but they also carried fleas in the fur of rats nesting in the cargo. And within those fleas, multiplying with mindless biological efficiency, were the bacteria that would reshape European civilization. Back in your own town, far from these distant events, you file away the rumours as you file away most things you can't do anything about. There are more immediate concerns. The rent is due, your apprentice keeps burning the porridge, and that persistent leak in the roof needs fixing before winter arrives. The east is far away, so far that most people you know couldn't tell you whether Constantinople is north or south of Jerusalem, and whatever horrors are unfolding there seem as remote as stories from scripture. But late at night, when sleep won't come and the shadows gather in the corners of your small room, you find yourself thinking about those silent cities. You imagine streets much like your own, emptied of life, the only sound the crying of abandoned animals and the creaking of doors left swinging on broken hinges. You imagine the smell, though your imagination surely falls short of the reality, of so many bodies with no one left to bury them. And then you tell yourself that such things happen in foreign lands to foreign people because of their foreign sins or their foreign ignorance or their foreign bad luck. Such things do not happen here, in familiar streets, to people who speak your language and worship your God and eat the same bread you eat for breakfast. The world is vast, after all, and surely there's enough distance between here and there to keep the horror contained. You pull your blanket tighter, listen to the breathing of whoever shares your bed, and eventually drift into an uneasy sleep punctuated by dreams you won't remember in the morning. The rumours continue to arrive, each one a little closer, a little more specific, a little harder to dismiss. Within a year, you will stop hearing rumours entirely. By then you won't need them. The evidence will be impossible to ignore, written in the faces of your neighbours, in the empty seats at church, in the carts that roll through the streets each morning collecting what the night has claimed. But for now, the whispers from the Silk Road are just whispers, easily lost in the ordinary noise of daily life. You go back to examining that eel, haggling with the fishmonger, complaining about the weather as though weather were the worst thing that could happen to a person. The merchant who told you about the empty cities has already moved on, taking his wool and his stories to the next town, the next market, the next group of listeners who will shake their heads at such wild tales before returning to their own mundane concerns. Somewhere far away, ships are loading cargo. Somewhere closer than you know, rats are boarding. The ship appears on the horizon like any other merchant vessel, its sails catching the Mediterranean light. In that way you've perhaps seen a dozen times before, without giving it much thought. But something is wrong. Even from the harbour wall where you've wandered to escape the afternoon heat, you can tell that the ship moves strangely, too slowly somehow, as though the crew has forgotten how to navigate or simply stopped caring. It's October of 1347, and you've found yourself in the Sicilian port of Messina, perhaps for trade, perhaps for family, perhaps simply because life has carried you here the way life carries everyone toward destinations they never quite planned. The harbour is usually a cheerful chaos of shouting stevedores, haggling merchants and sailors spending their wages with impressive speed at the waterfront taverns. Today feels different, though you couldn't say exactly why. The air itself seems to hold its breath. As the ship draws closer, you notice that hardly anyone moves on deck. A vessel of this size, a Genoese trading galley by the look of her rigging, should be bustling with activity as it approaches port. Ropes need handling, anchors need preparing. Someone should be shouting instructions that carry across the water, in that particular cadence sailors use to make themselves heard over wind and waves. Instead, the ship drifts in near silence, and the few figures visible on deck seem to be lying down. The harbour master, a practical man with a perpetually sunburned face, rows out to meet the vessel as is his duty. You watch his small boat approach the looming hull, watch him climb the rope ladder thrown down with what seems like enormous effort, watch him disappear over the railing. The minutes stretch. A crowd begins to gather on the dock, murmuring speculation about what cargo the ship carries, what prices might be had, whether the captain is someone they know. When the harbour master reappears at the railing, his face has turned the colour of old cheese. Even from this distance, you can see him cross himself repeatedly, before climbing down to his boat and rowing back with a speed that suggests pursuit by demons. "Dead," he gasps when he reaches the dock, stumbling onto solid ground like a man escaping a shipwreck. They're almost all dead, and the one still alive. He shakes his head, unwilling or unable to describe what he's seen. Black boils, on their necks, under their arms, in their groins, the size of eggs, some of them, leaking foulness, and the smell. He stops, bends over, and vomits onto the cobblestones while the gathered crowd takes several instinctive steps backward. This is how it begins, not with trumpets or apocalyptic visions, but with a sick man throwing up on a Tuesday afternoon while seabirds wheel overhead and the mundane business of the harbour grinds to an uncertain halt. The ships that arrived at Messina in those fateful October days came from Kaffa, that same besieged Crimean port where the Mongols had allegedly catapulted infected corpses over the walls. The merchants aboard had fled the city hoping to escape the plague, not realising they carried it with them in their blood, in their breath, in the fleas hiding in their clothing and their cargo. What the harbour master had witnessed was the disease in its full, horrifying bloom. The bubonic form of plague, the most common variety, takes its name from the buboes, those grotesque swellings of the lymph nodes that were often the first visible sign of infection. These buboes could appear in the groin, the armpits, or the neck, depending on where the infected flea had bitten, and they swelled to enormous sizes with terrifying speed. Some historical accounts describe them reaching the size of apples, though like all medieval measurements, this probably varied considerably. The swellings weren't the worst of it. Victims developed high fevers that could reach delirious levels, their bodies desperately trying to fight an infection they had no weapons against. The bacteria spread through the lymphatic system and into the bloodstream, causing hemorrhaging under the skin that left dark blotches, hence the name Black Death, though that term wouldn't actually become common until centuries later. In the medieval period, people called it simply the pestilence, the mortality, or the great dying. But here's a detail that somehow makes it worse. The disease didn't always kill quickly. Some victims lingered for days, fully conscious, watching their own bodies betray them while their families could do nothing but pray and wait. The mortality rate was staggering. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, but most estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population would die within the next few years. In some towns, the figure approached 90%. The authorities in Messina tried to respond quickly. They ordered the death ships, as the Genoese galleys would come to be known, to leave the harbour immediately, but it was already too late. The sailors who had briefly come ashore had made contact with locals. Rats had scurried down mooring ropes in the night. Fleas had found new hosts among the dock workers, the curious bystanders, the prostitutes who serviced arriving sailors, the children who played too close to the forbidden cargo. Within days, the first Sicilians began to develop fever. Within weeks, the graveyards were overflowing. You watch this unfolding with the numb disbelief of someone witnessing a natural disaster in slow motion. There's a peculiar quality to catastrophe when you're living through it, an inability to fully grasp the scale of what's happening because the human mind simply isn't built to process death on such a massive level. You hear that a neighbour has died, and you feel grief. You hear that an entire family has died, and you feel horror. But when entire streets begin to fall silent, when the bells that tolled for each death ring so constantly that they blur into a single endless note, something in your brain simply stutters. It cannot accept the reality, and so it keeps trying to apply normal patterns to abnormal circumstances. Maybe this is just a bad outbreak, you tell yourself. Cities have survived plagues before. Your grandmother mentioned something about a sickness in her youth that killed many people, and yet life continued afterward. Surely this will be the same. Surely the bodies piling up in the churches because the cemeteries filled up almost immediately represent the worst of it. And tomorrow, or next week, or next month, the dying will slow and stop and everyone can begin the work of returning to normal. But normal is a ship that has sailed, and it's not coming back to port. From Sicily, the plague spread with the inexorability of a flood. Ships carrying refugees, or simply continuing their regular trade routes, because commerce is remarkably persistent even in the face of apocalypse, carried the disease to mainland Italy within weeks. By January of 1348, it had reached Venice, Genoa and Pisa. By spring, it was in Florence, where it would kill perhaps half the city's population and inspire Giovanni Boccaccio to write the Decameron, a literary masterpiece framed around a group of young aristocrats fleeing to the countryside to escape the pestilence. The speed of transmission seems almost impossible until you remember the conditions of medieval life. People lived in close quarters, shared beds, wore clothing that couldn't be easily washed, and had no concept of microscopic organisms causing disease. The fleas that carried plague bacteria thrived in exactly these conditions. Warm bodies packed together, plenty of rats to serve as hosts, limited understanding of hygiene as a disease prevention measure. The death ships of Messina were just the first wave of an invasion that would wash across Europe for the next 4 years, leaving roughly 25 million dead in its wake, perhaps a third of the continent's entire population. In your small corner of this catastrophe, you watch the world you knew dissolve like morning frost in harsh sunlight. And somewhere, deep in your gut where hope refuses to die entirely, you begin to wonder, how do I survive this? To understand how people tried to survive the plague, you first need to understand how they understood their own bodies. And fair warning, this is where things get a bit weird by modern standards. You're about to enter a world where medicine operates on principles that seem almost charmingly wrong from a 21st century perspective, yet possess their own internal logic that held together remarkably well until reality came crashing through. You know nothing of bacteria. The very concept of microscopic organisms causing disease won't emerge for another 500 years, and even then, it will take decades for the idea to gain acceptance. What you do know, what every educated person in medieval Europe knows, is that health depends on the proper balance of 4 fundamental substances within the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This is humoral theory, and it has been the dominant medical paradigm since the ancient Greeks first proposed it more than 1,000 years before your birth. Hippocrates developed the early framework, Galen expanded it into an elaborate system during the Roman period, and Arabic physicians preserved and refined it during the centuries when Western Europe had largely forgotten how to read. By your time, it represents the accumulated wisdom of countless generations taught in every medical school, referenced in every physician's practice, and understood by ordinary people as simply the way bodies work. Each humour corresponds to an element, a season, a temperament, and a range of qualities that sound almost astrological to modern ears. Blood is hot and wet, associated with air and spring, producing a sanguine personality, cheerful, optimistic, perhaps a bit too fond of pleasure. Phlegm is cold and wet, linked to water and winter, creating phlegmatic individuals who are calm, perhaps excessively so, and prone to sluggishness. Yellow bile runs hot and dry, connected to fire and summer, resulting in choleric temperaments, quick to anger, ambitious, energetic. Black bile is cold and dry, tied to earth and autumn, producing melancholic personalities given to deep thought, artistic sensibility, and depression. When you fall ill, therefore, the explanation is straightforward. Your humours have become unbalanced. Perhaps you've accumulated too much blood, a common diagnosis, and need to have some removed through bleeding. Perhaps your black bile is built up, causing melancholy, and you need foods or activities associated with opposite qualities to restore equilibrium. The physician's job is to diagnose which humour is out of balance, and prescribe treatments to correct it. This system actually worked surprisingly well for many conditions, though not for the reasons medieval physicians believed. Recommending rest, bland foods, and moderate temperatures for someone with a fever, for instance, is perfectly sensible advice regardless of theoretical framework. The problems arose when treatments based on humoral theory actively harmed patients, bloodletting, for example, which weakens already compromised immune systems, or the use of toxic substances like mercury to purge unwanted humours. But humoral theory alone doesn't explain how medieval people understood plague specifically. For that, you need to consider miasma. Miasma theory held that disease spread through bad air, literally that corruption in the atmosphere could enter the body and cause illness. This corruption might arise from swamps, from rotting matter, from the conjunctions of planets, or from essentially any source that produced unpleasant smells. The logic seemed unassailable. Places that smelled bad often harboured disease, therefore bad smells must cause disease. The fact that actual causes, contaminated water, insect vectors, person-to-person transmission, often accompanied bad smells, made the correlation seem even more solid. When plague arrived, miasma theory provided a ready explanation. Something had corrupted the air over vast regions, something so profound that no amount of ordinary purification could eliminate it. Some physicians blamed earthquakes in Asia that had released poisonous vapours from deep within the earth. Others pointed to the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred in 1345, a celestial alignment that supposedly corrupted the atmosphere on a global scale. Historians still argue whether these astronomical explanations were taken literally by educated physicians, or merely served as convenient frameworks for explaining the inexplicable. And then there was God. For many, perhaps most medieval people, the plague's ultimate cause was obvious: divine punishment for sin. This explanation had the advantage of being unfalsifiable, while also aligning perfectly with the religious worldview that dominated all aspects of medieval life. Humanity had sinned, probably in some spectacular collective way, and God was expressing his displeasure through pestilence. Scripture provided ample precedent. The plagues visited upon Egypt, the various calamities described in Revelation, the general biblical theme of divine punishment for wickedness. This explanation created obvious problems for theology, of course. Why would God punish the innocent along with the guilty? Why did the disease strike children and clergy who presumably hadn't participated in whatever sins provoked divine wrath? Medieval theologians tied themselves in knots trying to answer these questions, with explanations ranging from the suffering of innocents serving to purify their souls to the essentially inscrutable nature of God's justice, which mortals could not hope to fully comprehend. But here's where it gets complicated, and perhaps a bit interesting from a modern perspective, because medieval people didn't necessarily see these different explanations as mutually exclusive. Your local priest might preach that the plague was divine punishment for sin, while your physician simultaneously recommended treatments based on humoral theory and miasma avoidance. One explanation addressed the ultimate cause, why is this happening, while the others addressed proximate causes, how does the disease actually spread and affect bodies? This theological medical hybrid thinking shaped every survival strategy that medieval people would attempt. If you wanted to protect yourself from plague, you needed to address both the spiritual and physical dimensions of the threat. You needed to purify your soul through prayer, confession and good works, while simultaneously purifying your body through dietary changes, bloodletting and avoidance of corrupt air. The irony, invisible to everyone at the time, is that some of these strategies accidentally worked, for reasons completely unrelated to the theoretical frameworks behind them. Avoiding crowded places reduced exposure to infected individuals, burning aromatic substances killed some fleas, isolating the sick prevented transmission. But other strategies, gathering in large groups for religious processions, bleeding patients who were already weakened by disease, actively made things worse. Standing in this strange landscape of competing theories and partial understanding, you're faced with decisions that literally mean life or death. The physicians offer treatments that sound impressive but often fail. The priests offer explanations that provide spiritual comfort but no physical protection. Your neighbours offer folk remedies passed down through generations, some of which are harmless nonsense and others of which are harmful nonsense. And somewhere in this chaos of competing advice, you have to make choices about what to eat, where to live, whom to visit, and whether to flee. Choices based on information that is fundamentally, catastrophically incomplete. Welcome to medieval public health. The exit signs are not well marked, and the map is mostly wrong. The moment you recognise the signs, your stomach drops into a cold void that no amount of rational thought can warm. You've heard the descriptions by now, everyone has, but hearing about something and witnessing it in your own flesh, or the flesh of someone you love, are entirely different experiences. Perhaps you notice it first as an unusual tiredness, the kind that settles into your bones like winter settling into the earth. You tell yourself it's nothing. You've been working hard, sleeping poorly, worrying too much about things beyond your control. Everyone is tired these days, with fear stalking the streets and death visiting neighbours whose names you knew, whose children played with your children, whose bread you bought just last week from hands now cold and still. But the tiredness deepens. By evening you're feverish, and by the next morning you can barely lift your head from the pillow. Your body aches in ways that feel fundamentally wrong, as though your muscles have decided to rebel against the very act of existing. And then, because you've been dreading this, because you've been unable to stop yourself from checking every few hours, even though you know the fear itself might be making you sick, you find it, the bubo. It starts as a tender spot, perhaps in your groin, perhaps in your armpit, perhaps in the soft tissue of your neck below your jaw. The lymph nodes in these areas are working overtime, trying desperately to filter out the bacterial invasion raging through your bloodstream. But Yersinia pestis is a cunning enemy, evolved over millennia to exploit exactly this immune response. The bacteria multiply within the lymph nodes themselves, causing them to swell with pus and necrotic tissue until they bulge obscenely against the skin. Within hours, the tender spot has grown to the size of a walnut. By the next day, it might reach the size of an egg. The skin over the swelling stretches tight, darkens, and may eventually rupture, releasing foul-smelling discharge. The pain is extraordinary. A throbbing, burning sensation that makes movement excruciating and sleep nearly impossible. Medieval physicians documented these symptoms with clinical precision, though their explanations for what was happening differed dramatically from modern understanding. They believed the buboes represented the body's attempt to expel corrupt humours, which, in a weird way, wasn't entirely wrong. The immune system was indeed trying to isolate and eliminate the invading bacteria, just not through the mechanism of humoral expulsion. But the buboes, horrifying as they were, represented only one form the disease could take. Historians still argue about how many distinct varieties of plague existed during the Black Death, but modern analysis generally identifies three main forms based on where the bacteria concentrated. Bubonic plague, the most common form, worked through the lymphatic system as just described. It killed somewhere between 50 and 70% of untreated cases, typically within a week of symptom onset. The relatively slow progression, and those quotation marks are doing a lot of work, meant that some patients survived long enough for their immune systems to mount an effective response. These survivors often found themselves immune to subsequent infection, which would become significant as the plague returned in waves over the following decades. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, multiplying so rapidly that the immune system was overwhelmed before it could respond effectively. This form killed with terrifying speed, sometimes within 24 hours of the first symptoms, and produced the dramatic skin blackening that contributed to the disease's later name. Hemorrhaging beneath the skin created dark patches that could spread across the entire body, giving victims a bruised, mottled appearance that resembled nothing so much as death, claiming them before they'd finished dying. Pneumonic plague was perhaps the most frightening form of all. When the bacteria reached the lungs, victims developed severe respiratory symptoms, coughing, bloody sputum, difficulty breathing, and became capable of spreading the disease through the air itself. Unlike the other forms, which required flea bites to transmit, pneumonic plague could spread through coughing, sneezing, or even close conversation, and it killed almost 100% of untreated cases, typically within 2 to 3 days. The coexistence of these different forms helps explain why the Black Death spread so quickly and killed so many. A single infected person might begin with bubonic symptoms, develop septicemic complications as the bacteria entered their bloodstream, and ultimately die of pneumonic plague while spreading the airborne form to everyone around them. Each form fed into the others, creating a cascade of transmission that normal disease containment measures couldn't hope to interrupt. The symptoms extended beyond the dramatic buboes and skin darkening. Victims often reported intense thirst, as fever dehydrated their bodies faster than medieval hydration practices could compensate. Many experienced delirium and hallucinations, their fever-addled brains producing visions that religious observers sometimes interpreted as either divine revelation or demonic torment. The disease attacked the digestive system as well, causing vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain that added to the patient's misery. And then there was the smell. Contemporary accounts describe the odour of plague victims with a vocabulary of revulsion that suggests it was unlike anything else in their experience. And keep in mind, these were people who lived with chamber pots, open sewers, and limited bathing. Something about the particular mix of bacterial toxins, necrotic tissue, and human suffering produced a stench that became synonymous with death itself. Physicians and priests who attended the dying often covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar or aromatic substances, as much to block the smell as to protect against miasmatic corruption. If you found yourself developing these symptoms, what could you do? The honest answer is, not much. Medieval medicine had no effective treatment for bacterial infection, no antibiotics, no intravenous fluids to combat dehydration, no isolation wards designed to prevent transmission. What they had were treatments based on humoral theory, bleeding, purging, adjusting diet, that mostly made things worse. But people tried anyway, because when faced with death, humans have never been good at accepting helplessness. They lanced the buboes to drain the corrupt humours, a procedure that may have occasionally provided relief but more often introduced secondary infections. They applied poultices of human feces to draw out the poison, live chickens, whose body heat supposedly countered cold humours, and crushed emeralds, expensive and useless, but at least it wasn't feces. They drank concoctions of powdered gold, mercury and theriac, an ancient remedy composed of dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh, that served as the medieval equivalent of snake oil. One particularly creative treatment involved placing a live frog or toad on the buboes, supposedly to absorb the toxic humours through their skin. The frogs presumably did not appreciate this medical innovation, yet amid all this desperate flailing, some people survived. Not because of the treatments, certainly, but despite them. Their immune systems, for reasons that geneticists still work to understand, managed to defeat the bacterial invasion before it could prove fatal. These survivors would form the nucleus of whatever community remained after the plague passed, and their immunity would become one of the factors that gradually reduced the disease's devastation over subsequent generations. For now, though, you can only watch the symptoms unfold and hope Hope that the fever breaks. Hope that the buboes drain without killing. Hope that you're one of the lucky ones whose body somehow inexplicably fights off an enemy that has claimed millions. Hope is a thin shield against Yersinia pestis, but it's the only shield most people had. Your first instinct when the plague arrives in your town and the dying begins in earnest is to run. This isn't cowardice. It's the most rational response available, given your understanding of how disease spreads. If bad air causes sickness, then removing yourself from the bad air should logically prevent infection. Every fibre of your being screams to grab whatever possessions you can carry and flee to somewhere, anywhere, that death hasn't yet reached. You're not alone in this instinct. Across Europe, the plague triggered one of the largest mass migrations in medieval history, as millions of people abandoned their homes and fled toward an imagined safety that kept receding just beyond the horizon. Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron provides one of our most vivid accounts of the plague in Florence, describes the exodus with barely concealed contempt for those who fled, though his 10 noble storytellers notably removed themselves to a country villa to wait out the pestilence, which suggests that even critics of flight sometimes practiced it. The wealthy left first, naturally, because they had somewhere to go and means to get there. Country estates that had served as pleasant summer retreats became desperate refuges. Distant relatives who might normally receive only a polite annual letter suddenly found themselves hosting houseguests with no departure date. The flight pattern spread outward from cities like ripples from a stone dropped in water. First to leave were those with connections to rural properties, nobles, wealthy merchants, churchmen with ties to countryside abbeys. Then went the professionals who served the wealthy and followed them to maintain their income. Then the skilled craftsmen who realised their workshops stood empty anyway, because no one was buying luxury goods when death stalked the streets. Then anyone else who could scrape together the resources to travel and had anywhere at all to go. Those who stayed behind were typically those who had no choice. The poor, the sick, the elderly, the duty-bound. Physicians were technically expected to remain and treat patients, though many found creative interpretations of this obligation. Some parish priests stayed with their flocks even unto death. We'll talk more about these brave souls later, while others followed the wealthy towards safer ground, leaving their spiritual charges to face mortality alone. But here's the problem that nobody fleeing quite understood. You can't outrun something you're already carrying. The plague's incubation period, the time between infection and the appearance of symptoms, could range from a few days to over a week, depending on the form of the disease and the health of the individual. This meant that people who felt perfectly fine when they boarded their carts and horses, who showed no sign of illness as they bade farewell to their plague-stricken towns, could be carrying bacteria that would bloom into fatal infection days later. These unwitting carriers became the plague's most effective vectors, spreading the disease to communities that might otherwise have been spared. A wealthy merchant who fled Venice for his country estate brought the plague to the surrounding villages. A family escaping Florence carried it to Siena. Pilgrims who abandoned Rome spread it along every road leading away from the Eternal City. The mathematics of flight worked against survival in ways nobody could calculate. If 10,000 people fled a city where the plague was raging, perhaps 500 of them carried the disease without knowing it. When those 500 arrived in their various destinations, some to rural villages, some to other cities, some to isolated farmsteads, they became new points of origin for outbreaks that spread in turn. And yet, despite this grim logic, flight wasn't entirely futile. Some people did escape. Some communities remained uninfected. Some individuals who fled early enough and travelled far enough, and were lucky enough to avoid contact with other carriers, survived precisely because they weren't present when their home communities were devastated. The key, though nobody understood it at the time, was timing and isolation. Those who fled before the plague arrived, at the first whisper of rumours from distant towns, sometimes reached safety before the disease caught up with them. Those who fled to genuinely remote locations where other travellers rarely passed, sometimes avoided exposure entirely. The mountain villages of the Alps, the isolated farmsteads of rural England, the fishing communities clinging to the edges of the known world. These places sometimes remained untouched not because they had special protections, but because the disease simply never arrived. This created a cruel lottery that defied the medieval understanding of plague as divine punishment. Sin was surely no less prevalent in the spared communities than in the devastated ones. Prayer wasn't obviously more fervent in surviving villages than in those that died to the last resident. The seemingly random pattern of destruction and preservation confused theologians and ordinary believers alike, challenging the comfortable assumption that righteousness offered protection. Historians still argue whether flight should be considered a legitimate survival strategy or merely a method of spreading the disease more widely. The answer, frustratingly, seems to be both. Individual survival sometimes improved through flight, if you happen to flee in the right direction at the right time, while collective survival certainly worsened as the disease found new populations to devastate. For you, standing at this crossroads, the decision carries a weight that's difficult to overstate. If you flee and carry the plague to your rural relatives, you might doom them all. If you stay and the disease takes you, your family line ends here. If you flee and happen to be uninfected, you might live to see grandchildren. If you stay and happen to be naturally resistant, you might emerge into a post-plague world with opportunities that would have been impossible before. There's no way to know which path leads to survival and which to death. There's only the choice, and the consequences, and the long uncertain road between them. The carts are loading in the town square. The wealthier families have already departed. The roads out of town grow crowded with refugees carrying whatever they could grab in their haste to escape. Do you join them, taking your chances with the unknown, or do you stay, hoping that familiar walls and familiar faces offer some protection against the unfamiliar death that stalks outside? The choice is yours. The outcome belongs to fate, or God, or the blind mathematics of bacterial transmission. Whatever framework helps you make sense of a world that has suddenly stopped making sense. Either way, the bells keep tolling behind you, and somewhere ahead, in whatever destination you choose or are forced into by circumstances beyond your control, other bells wait to toll in turn. While some fled and others prayed, a handful of communities stumbled onto something that looked, in retrospect, remarkably like modern public health policy. The idea was simple enough that anyone could understand it, yet radical enough that most places never implemented it effectively. Keep the sick away from the healthy. Keep the possibly sick away from everyone. Keep the entire possibly contaminated outside world away from your town. Quarantine, as this practice would eventually be called, represents one of the Black Death's most enduring legacies, a concept born in desperation that would shape disease control efforts for centuries to come. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, though the practice evolved significantly before that specific time frame became standard. In the earliest plague outbreaks, officials experimented with various isolation periods, 10 days, 30 days, whatever seemed to work or whatever some authority had decreed based on numerological significance or educated guesswork. Venice, that remarkable city floating improbably on its lagoon, became one of the pioneers of quarantine measures. The Venetians had particular incentive. Their entire economy depended on maritime trade, but ships were obviously vectors for plague transmission. If they simply banned all incoming vessels, they'd destroy their own prosperity. But if they allowed ships to dock freely, they'd import death along with silks and spices. The solution they developed was characteristically Venetian, practical, systematic, and just authoritarian enough to actually work. Ships arriving from plague-affected areas were required to anchor in the lagoon for 40 days before anyone could disembark. During this waiting period, officials watched for signs of illness among the crew. If no symptoms appeared, the ship was eventually cleared to enter the port. If illness broke out, the ship was either burned or kept indefinitely isolated until everyone aboard had either recovered or died. The 40-day period, historians still argue, may have derived from Christian significance. Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, the 40 days of Lent, the general biblical association of 40 with trial and transformation. Alternatively, it may have been a practical observation that most plague cases resolved one way or another within that time frame. Either explanation reveals how medieval thinking blended religious and empirical reasoning in ways that modern categories struggle to capture. Other cities developed their own isolation protocols with varying degrees of sophistication. Milan, under the famously ruthless Visconti family, implemented some of the harshest measures recorded. When plague was discovered in a house, authorities didn't just isolate the sick, they sealed the entire household inside, healthy members included, sometimes nailing the doors shut. If everyone inside died, the house was burned. If anyone survived, they remained sealed in until officials decided the danger had passed. This sounds brutal because it was brutal. Healthy family members were essentially condemned to death alongside their sick relatives, trapped in close quarters with active plague transmission, watching their loved ones die while waiting for their own turn. The practice raises profound ethical questions that medical ethicists still debate. Does the collective good of containing an epidemic justify sacrificing individuals who might otherwise have survived? But here's the uncomfortable truth that the mortality statistics reveal. Milan fared better than almost any other major Italian city during the Black Death. While Florence lost perhaps half its population and Venice nearly 2/3, Milan's death toll remained significantly lower. The harsh measures worked, in the narrow sense that they reduced overall deaths, though at the cost of individual deaths that deliberate policy had caused. Town walls, those medieval fortifications originally designed for military defence, suddenly acquired a new purpose. Cities that had maintained their walls in good repair could close their gates against the outside world, restricting entry to essential commerce while denying access to refugees who might carry the disease. Guards at the gates could inspect incoming travellers for signs of illness, turning away anyone who looked unwell or who came from known plague areas. This transformed the social geography of survival. Rural villages without walls had no way to implement systematic exclusion. Major trade cities that depended on constant commerce couldn't afford to close their gates for the months or years the plague persisted. But smaller towns with intact fortifications, towns that could survive temporary isolation because they had agricultural land nearby and water sources within the walls, these places sometimes achieved remarkable preservation simply by refusing entry to the outside world. The social consequences of quarantine measures were profound and not always positive. Trade disrupted, communities isolated from each other lost the economic and cultural connections that had bound medieval society together. The suspicion of outsiders that quarantine encouraged could slide easily into xenophobia, with tragic consequences for already marginalised groups. And the arbitrary nature of enforcement, who got sealed in their house, who was allowed to flee before the gates closed, often reflected existing social hierarchies rather than any rational assessment of disease risk. You might find yourself in a town that decides to implement strict isolation measures. One morning, the bells ring differently, not for another death, but for a decree. The gates are closing. No one in, no one out until the pestilence passes. Your relatives outside the walls will have to fend for themselves. Your business contacts in the next city can no longer be reached. The world shrinks to the circumference of these ancient stones. Some of your neighbours rage against the restriction, demanding their right to leave, to flee, to take their chances on the open road like so many others. Others breathe visible relief, grateful that something is finally being done, that some barrier, however imperfect, now stands between them and the creeping death. You're not sure which group you belong to. The walls feel protective and imprisoning at the same time. The gates that keep plague out also trap you in if the disease somehow finds its way inside. Every stranger within the walls becomes a potential threat. Every cough or sneeze a cause for alarm. But when news eventually filters in from the outside, and it always does, through merchants at the gates shouting their wares, through letters passed at spear point across the threshold, you hear that the cities that stayed open are dying by the thousands while your closed community counts its dead in dozens. Quarantine works. It works imperfectly, unjustly, with collateral damage that accounting books cannot measure. But in a world without antibiotics, without understanding of bacterial transmission, without any of the tools that modern medicine takes for granted, simply avoiding the disease turns out to be the most effective medicine available. 40 days behind closed gates. Sounds like a prison sentence. It might be the only sentence that doesn't end in death. If you were wealthy enough or desperate enough to summon a physician during the plague years, the figure who arrived at your bedside might have looked like something from a nightmare, designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything except that birds were somehow involved. The plague doctor's iconic costume, that long black robe, those glass goggles, that horrifying beaked mask, has become one of the most recognisable images of the Black Death in popular imagination. What's fascinating is that the costume didn't actually exist during the first outbreak in 1347 to 1351. It was developed later, during subsequent plague recurrences, as physicians searched for ways to protect themselves while treating patients who had become, quite literally, poison to anyone who came near them. But let's back up to the Black Death proper and examine what physicians actually did during those terrible years, because the story is stranger and sadder than the dramatic costume suggests. Medieval physicians operated under significant constraints. many of which they themselves didn't recognise. Their training, typically acquired at university medical faculties, centred on the works of ancient authorities, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, whose theories had calcified into something approaching dogma. A physician who contradicted Galen was like a theologian who contradicted scripture. Possibly brilliant, more likely heretical, certainly career-limiting. This meant that when the plague arrived presenting symptoms unlike anything the ancient authorities had described, physicians found themselves working from a playbook that simply didn't apply. The buboes, the rapid death, the apparent transmission through proximity, none of this fit neatly into humoral theory. Some physicians rose to the challenge by attempting to incorporate plague into existing frameworks, producing elaborate explanations involving astrological influences and corrupt vapours that satisfied theoretical requirements while offering no practical guidance. Others simply fled, abandoning their posts on the grounds that treating plague patients was suicide with extra steps. Those who stayed and tried to help employed the full arsenal of medieval medical treatment, which is to say they tried various methods of making things worse in theoretically justified ways. Bloodletting remained the default response to almost any serious illness, and plague was no exception. Physicians reasoned that the disease represented corrupt blood accumulating in the body, so removing blood should help restore balance. In practice, bloodletting weakened patients, who were already fighting for their lives, accelerating death rather than preventing it. The amounts drained could be astonishing. Pints of blood drawn from patients who needed every drop to fuel their immune response. Lancing the buboes followed similar logic. If the swellings contained corrupt humours attempting to exit the body, then helping them exit faster seemed sensible. Physicians would cut into the buboes to drain the accumulated matter, sometimes cauterizing the wounds with hot irons afterward to seal them against further corruption. This was exactly as painful as it sounds, and it introduced infection risk into already compromised systems, but occasionally, by sheer chance, it may have provided some relief to patients whose buboes were ready to rupture anyway. The medicines prescribed during plague outbreaks read like a catalogue of desperation masked as expertise. Theriac, that ancient compound supposedly effective against all poisons, was prescribed so universally that prices skyrocketed and counterfeit versions flooded the market. Pills made from powdered gemstones, particularly emeralds and rubies, were thought to counteract the disease's corruption through the innate purity of precious stones. Mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances appeared in various remedies on the theory that strong poisons might drive out the plague poison. One recurring recommendation involved surrounding yourself with strong odours, on the theory that pleasant or pungent smells might counteract the miasmatic corruption causing the disease. Physicians advised carrying posies of flowers, burning aromatic woods like juniper or rosemary, soaking cloths in vinegar to breathe through, or even sitting between two large fires to purify the air through heat. The famous nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Rosy," has long been popularly associated with plague symptoms and these preventive measures, though historians actually argue that this connection was invented centuries later and has no documentary support. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the mindset of the era. Some physicians recommended that patients spend time in the presence of goats, whose powerful body odour was thought capable of absorbing pestilential vapours. The goat essentially served as a living air purifier, absorbing the bad air so the patient wouldn't have to breathe it. Whether this helped anyone is doubtful, but it certainly provided employment for goat herds. The beaked mask that would later become iconic served a specific purpose within miasma theory. The long beak was stuffed with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, spices, camphor, that the physician would breathe through while examining patients. The idea was to filter and purify the air before it reached the physician's lungs, creating a barrier of pleasant odour against the corrupt atmosphere surrounding plague victims. The rest of the costume developed along similar protective lines. The long robe, ideally made of waxed fabric, covered the body and could be burned or cleaned after contact with patients. The gloves protected the hands from directly touching infectious material. The glass eyes allowed vision while sealing the eye sockets against miasmatic penetration. The hat and hood covered the hair, which was thought to particularly absorb corrupt vapours. Did any of this work? Oddly yes, in limited ways, though not for the reasons physicians believed. The heavy robes and gloves reduced skin contact with infected fleas. The mask, besides filtering air, created physical distance between the physician's face and the patient's respiratory droplets. The general cumbersome nature of the costume may have discouraged long visits, reducing exposure time, but mostly physicians died alongside their patients. The mortality rate among medical professionals during plague outbreaks was catastrophic, both because their work brought them into constant contact with the infected and because their treatments often increased their exposure to the disease they were trying to cure. You watch the physician approach your bedside, and despite your fear, despite the knowledge that this figure represents your best chance at survival, something in you recoils. The mask turns toward you like a bird considering whether you're worth eating. The glass eyes reflect your own terrified face back at you. A gloved hand reaches out to feel your forehead. Whatever happens next, you're in the hands of someone who genuinely wants to help you, but lacks any tool capable of actually doing so. Medieval medicine during the plague was ultimately a story of good intentions and theoretical sophistication, meeting a problem that required knowledge that wouldn't exist for 500 years. The physician begins to recommend treatments. You listen, nod, hope. Somewhere deep in your body, where bacteria and immune cells fight their invisible war, the real outcome is already being decided. While physicians offered treatments based on learned theory, ordinary people developed their own approaches to warding off the plague. Folk remedies passed through generations, adapted from ancient practices, or invented on the spot by desperate minds grasping at any hope. These remedies ranged from the surprisingly sensible to the deeply strange, and all of them tell us something about how medieval people understood their relationship with disease, nature, and the invisible forces that seem to govern life and death. Herbs dominated popular plague prevention efforts, and not without reason. Centuries of accumulated folk knowledge had identified plants with genuine medicinal properties, even if the theoretical explanations for why they worked were entirely wrong. Rosemary was burned in sick rooms and carried in bundles against the chest, its strong scent thought to purify the air, while its antimicrobial properties may have offered some actual benefit. Garlic was eaten raw or hung in doorways, its reputation as a protective agent so strong that it would eventually become a staple of vampire mythology, making it effective against two completely different types of blood-related folklore threats. Juniper branches were burned so universally that the smoke became synonymous with plague times. Walking through a medieval town during an outbreak, you would notice this smell immediately, that sharp, resinous fragrance cutting through the more unpleasant odours of sickness and death. The smoke was supposed to cleanse the air of corrupt vapours, and while it certainly made breathing more interesting, its actual effect on plague transmission was negligible. However, fire itself may have helped in ways nobody understood. Intense heat could kill fleas, and the practice of burning the possessions and bedding of plague victims sometimes eliminated these actual vectors before they could spread the disease further. Vinegar appeared in countless plague remedies, used to wash hands, soak cloths held over the face, clean surfaces, and even consumed diluted in water. The acidity of vinegar does possess genuine antimicrobial properties, and the habit of washing hands and surfaces with vinegar-soaked rags may have provided some actual protection, though nothing like what soap and water with proper technique would offer. Physicians recommended vinegar baths, vinegar inhalation, and vinegar-soaked sponges carried in the hand for constant protection. The Four Thieves vinegar legend supposedly originated during plague times, though historians still argue about its authenticity. The story goes that four thieves were caught robbing plague victims' houses, and, when questioned about how they survived such dangerous work, revealed a special vinegar recipe infused with herbs that protected them from infection. Whether this tale is historical or apocryphal, Four Thieves vinegar remained a popular remedy for centuries, and its recipe, typically including garlic, rosemary, thyme, sage, and other aromatic herbs, at least smelled like it should work. Fire played a central role in plague prevention beyond simply burning aromatic woods. Some authorities recommended walking between two large bonfires, on the theory that the heat would purify the air entering your lungs. Others advised keeping fires burning constantly in sick rooms, ostensibly to drive out corrupt vapours, but possibly, accidentally, helping to reduce flea populations. The Pope himself, sitting in Avignon during the plague's devastation of southern France, reportedly spent the summer of 1348 between two enormous fires despite the Mediterranean heat, on the advice of his physician Guy de Chauliac. Animals featured in some of the stranger remedies. Beyond the goats mentioned earlier, some recommendations involved placing pigeons, cut open while still alive, against the buboes to draw out poison. Others suggested that the breath of young healthy animals particularly horses or cattle, could counteract pestilential vapours. Keeping spiders alive in walnuts and wearing them around the neck was thought by some to provide protection, on the principle that spiders were natural poison catchers. Whether anyone actually did this or whether it remained a theoretical suggestion is difficult to determine, but medieval people's relationship with the natural world was intimate enough that such practices wouldn't have seemed as strange then as they do now. Precious and semi-precious stones were ground into powders and consumed with the desperate hope that their inherent purity would combat the disease's corruption. Pearls were particularly valued, their association with purity and their supposed cooling properties, making them seem ideal for counteracting plague's feverish heat. Ground unicorn horn, actually rhinoceros horn or narwhal tusk, obtained through the exotic trade networks of the era, commanded astronomical prices as a universal antidote to all poisons and diseases. Amulets and talismans occupied a space between medicine and magic that medieval thinking didn't clearly distinguish. Words of scripture written on parchment and worn against the skin, symbols supposedly representing powerful protective forces, objects blessed by holy figures or associated with saints. All of these were employed in the hope of divine or supernatural protection. Some amulets contained specific prayers or Bible verses believed to offer particular protection against plague. Others incorporated fragments of saints' relics, that peculiarly medieval market in holy body parts that drove enormous commerce and occasional outright fraud. The famous posy or pocket full of posies involved carrying bouquets of flowers or herbs, their pleasant fragrances supposedly creating a pocket of pure air around the carrier that pestilence couldn't penetrate. Women and men alike carried these nosegays, pressed them to their faces when passing through areas of bad smell, and scattered flower petals in rooms where the sick had lain. The floral industry, such as it was, probably did quite well during plague years. What strikes a modern observer about these folk remedies is their combination of desperate creativity and fundamental misunderstanding. Almost every practice aimed at purifying the air or counteracting some imagined corruption, because that was the best theory available for how disease spread. The actual transmission routes, flea bites, respiratory droplets, contaminated materials, remained invisible not just microscopically but conceptually. Yet some remedies worked accidentally. Avoiding crowded places worked because it reduced exposure. Burning bedding worked because it killed fleas. Isolating the sick worked because it interrupted transmission. The folk wisdom that slowly accumulated over centuries of plague recurrence included genuine insights embedded within frameworks of misunderstanding. You might find yourself in the depths of a plague outbreak, stuffing your pillow with rosemary, burning juniper in your fireplace, carrying a posy of flowers wherever you go, and drinking vinegar water with every meal. Does it help? You cannot know. But it provides the comfort of action, the sense that you're doing something rather than simply waiting for fate to find you. In a world without effective medicine, that comfort might be worth more than any cure. When all else fails, when the physicians can offer nothing that works, when the folk remedies prove equally futile, when the people you love continue to die despite every effort to save them, you turn to the only power great enough to oppose death itself. You turn to prayer. The religious response to the Black Death was overwhelming, and for medieval Europeans this made perfect sense. God governed all things, from the fall of sparrows to the rise of empires. If plague devastated the land, it could only be because God willed it, whether as punishment for sin, as a test of faith, or for reasons inscrutable to mortal understanding. And if God had sent the plague, only God could take it away. Churches that had been moderately attended before the plague suddenly overflowed with desperate worshippers. Priests who had grown accustomed to performing services for dutiful but somewhat distracted congregations now faced parishioners who hung on every word as though their souls depended on it, which, according to the theology of the era, they did. Confession lines stretched out the doors as people who had perhaps delayed confronting their sins suddenly felt the urgency of getting right with God before death claimed them. The rituals of the church took on new intensity. Mass became not merely obligation but lifeline. Communion offered not just spiritual nourishment but protection, the body and blood of Christ entering your body to drive out whatever corruption might be taking hold. Confession cleansed the soul of sins that might have attracted divine punishment. Extreme unction, the last rites, became so common that its administration lost some of its terror. People who survived initial illness sometimes received it multiple times during subsequent plague recurrences. Special prayers and liturgies developed specifically for plague times. The most famous was the prayer to St. Sebastian, a Roman soldier martyred by arrows who had become associated with protection against plague, the arrows that pierced his body symbolically representing the arrows of pestilence that God might send against sinful humanity. Churches dedicated to St. Sebastian saw enormous increases in attendance and offerings. Images of the saint, his body pierced but his face serene in faith, appeared everywhere. St. Roch, or Rocco in Italian, became another plague saint during the 14th century. According to his legend, Roch was a French pilgrim who travelled to Italy and devoted himself to caring for plague victims. When he himself contracted the disease, he retreated to a forest to die alone, but a dog brought him bread daily and licked his buboes until he recovered. He returned to France, was arrested as a spy because the plague had so changed his appearance that his own family didn't recognise him, and died in prison. His story, healing, service, suffering, and miraculous survival made him the perfect patron for those facing the plague's devastation. Pilgrimages, already a major feature of medieval religious life, intensified during plague years despite the obvious risks of travel. Pilgrims journey to shrines associated with healing saints, touching relics believed to hold miraculous power, walking paths that generations of faithful had walked before them. The famous pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Canterbury, saw steady traffic even as plague killed pilgrims along the way. The logic was straightforward. If you were going to die anyway, better to die seeking divine mercy than cowering at home. Relics, the physical remains of saints or objects associated with their lives, became intensely valuable. A bone fragment from a holy figure, a piece of cloth that had touched a saint's body, a splinter allegedly from the true cross. These objects were believed to channel divine power directly into the physical world. Churches competed for important relics, and the relic trade expanded to meet desperate demand. Fraud was rampant. The medieval world probably contained enough wood allegedly from the true cross to build a small fleet, and enough saints' finger bones to furnish several hundred hands. But here's where religious response to plague gets complicated, because prayer and pilgrimage gathered people together, exactly the conditions that helped plague spread. A church packed with worshippers became a perfect transmission environment. Pilgrimage routes became highways of infection. The very faith that people hoped would save them sometimes hastened their deaths. Historians still argue about whether religious gatherings significantly worsened plague mortality. The evidence is difficult to interpret because so many factors influence transmission patterns. But the irony is unmistakable. The desperate turn toward community, toward shared worship, toward physical proximity with fellow believers seeking divine protection, may have increased the very danger people sought to escape. Some religious figures recognized this and advised against large gatherings, recommending instead private prayer and family devotions. Others saw the gathering of the faithful as essential, regardless of physical risk. If God wanted to take you through plague contracted at Mass, that was God's will, and cowering at home wouldn't change your appointed hour. The tension between practical disease prevention and religious obligation would resurface in pandemic after pandemic, right up to the present day. You kneel in the church, surrounded by your neighbours, their breath mixing with yours in the candlelit air. The priest intones prayers in Latin that you don't understand but find comforting nonetheless. The familiar rhythms of worship anchor you in a world that has otherwise lost all stability. Around you, people weep openly, their faces raw with grief and fear. Maybe prayer will help. Maybe God will hear the desperate petitions rising from this church and from thousands of churches across the plague-stricken lands. Maybe the saints are already interceding, their celestial advocacy on your behalf working in ways you cannot perceive. Or maybe the breath of the coughing man 2 rows behind you carries pneumonic plague bacteria that are even now drifting toward your lungs. Either way, you pray. What else can you do? The procession moves through the streets at twilight, and even before you see them, you hear them. The crack of leather on flesh, the rhythmic grunts of exertion, the occasional cry that sounds more like ecstasy than pain. The Flagellants have arrived in your town, and their performance of suffering will haunt your dreams for years to come. The Flagellant movement represents one of the most dramatic and disturbing responses to the Black Death, a mass phenomenon of public self-torture that swept across Europe during the plague years and terrified both secular and religious authorities. To understand it, you need to understand the theological logic that made it seem not just reasonable, but necessary to thousands of participants. If plague was divine punishment for sin, the reasoning went, then the solution was to show God how sorry humanity was for whatever it had done. Words alone couldn't convey sufficient penitence. Prayer and fasting, the traditional tools of spiritual discipline, seemed inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe. What was needed was suffering. Suffering that matched the suffering God was inflicting. Suffering that demonstrated through physical agony the depth of human repentance. The Flagellants organised themselves into groups, sometimes called brotherhoods or confraternities, with elaborate rules governing their conduct. A typical flagellant journey lasted 33.5 days, representing Christ's years on earth. Participants swore oaths of obedience to their leader, agreed to specific codes of conduct, and committed to performing public flagellation twice, daily, for the duration of their pilgrimage. The actual whipping was not subtle. Flagellants used leather straps studded with iron spikes, designed to draw blood with every stroke. They stripped to the waist regardless of weather, knelt in public squares and beat themselves in choreographed patterns, while singing hymns and calling on God for mercy. The blood that flowed down their backs was considered sacred, and crowds gathered to dip cloths in it as relics, believing it held protective power. From a modern psychological perspective, the flagellant movement displays features common to movements of mass hysteria. The contagious nature of emotional extremity, the way individual restraint dissolves in collective fervour, the self-reinforcing cycle of performance and response that drives behaviour toward ever greater intensity. People who would never have tortured themselves alone found themselves joining processions and participating in rituals that, in any other context, would have seemed insane. But here's the genuinely strange part. The Flagellants weren't entirely marginal figures. At first, religious authorities cautiously tolerated or even encouraged the movement, seeing in it evidence of sincere repentance that might appease divine wrath. Prominent figures joined processions. Entire towns turned out to witness the spectacles and participate in the prayers that accompanied them. The movement spread across Germany into the Low Countries, France, England and beyond, attracting thousands of participants and uncountable observers. The shift came gradually, as flagellant groups began to develop characteristics that alarmed the establishment. Some groups claimed that their 33-day penance could cleanse all sin, effectively bypassing the Church's monopoly on forgiveness. Others began attacking clergy who criticised them, viewing priests as the corrupt guardians of a failed institution that had allowed God's wrath to fall upon the world. The anti-clerical turn opened doors to other heresies, including the persecution of Jews that we'll discuss in the next section. Pope Clement VI formally condemned the flagellant movement in 1349, declaring it heretical and ordering its suppression. The movement didn't disappear immediately. Popular religious phenomena rarely respond quickly to official condemnation, but the papal bull provided justification for secular authorities to crack down on flagellant processions. By 1350, the organised movement had largely collapsed, though individual flagellant practices would continue in various forms for centuries. Historians still argue about the flagellant movement's ultimate significance. Was it a genuine popular uprising against established religious authority, a proto-Reformation challenging the Church's claim to mediate between humanity and God? Was it simply mass hysteria, people driven temporarily mad by trauma responding in the most dramatic way their culture made available? Was it a form of medieval performance art, using spectacle to process collective grief in ways that more restrained rituals couldn't achieve? Whatever the interpretation, the Flagellants reveal something important about the psychological impact of the Black Death. This wasn't just a public health crisis, it was a civilizational trauma that shook the foundations of how people understood their relationship with God, with authority, with each other. When the normal channels of coping proved inadequate, new channels emerged, some of them alarming, most of them temporary, all of them testimony to human beings' desperate creativity in the face of catastrophe. You watch the procession pass, their backs striped with blood, their faces twisted in expressions that mix agony and transcendence. The crowd around you responds with a murmur of prayers, some joining the procession as it moves toward the town square, others shrinking back in horror or disgust. Part of you understands the logic. If whipping yourself until you bleed might save your soul, might turn aside God's wrath, might bring the plague to an end, wouldn't you consider it? How much suffering would you accept to protect the people you love, to survive this unsurvivable catastrophe? Another part of you knows that this is madness, that beating your own back does nothing to address the actual causes of disease, that the blood spattering the cobblestones carries no special power. But in a world where nothing you do seems to matter, where death chooses its victims by criteria you cannot fathom, perhaps the Flagellants have found the only honest response, to match outer suffering with inner suffering, to perform through your own flesh the anguish that circumstances have inflicted on your heart. The procession passes, the hymns fade into the evening air. Tomorrow they will be gone, moving to the next town in their endless pilgrimage of pain. And you will be here, trying to survive by whatever means you can find. The accusations begin as whispers, but they don't stay that way for long. Jews, someone says, have been poisoning the wells. They've been spreading the plague deliberately, killing Christians as part of some vast conspiracy. The proof? Everyone knows the proof. Everyone has heard from someone who saw something suspicious. The details vary, but the conclusion never does. This section is difficult to discuss, not because the historical facts are unclear, they're actually quite well documented, but because the events reveal something deeply ugly about human nature under stress. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death represents one of the most shameful episodes in medieval European history, and it demonstrates how easily fear transforms into violence against convenient scapegoats. The accusation of well poisoning had no factual basis whatsoever. Jews contracted plague and died from it at rates comparable to their Christian neighbours. If they had possessed some secret poison causing the disease, they would presumably have protected themselves. The geographical pattern of plague spread showed no correlation with Jewish population concentrations. Areas without significant Jewish communities were devastated, alongside areas with large Jewish populations. Multiple Jewish communities provided evidence and testimony, refuting the accusations, all of which was ignored by mobs determined to find someone to blame. But facts rarely matter when collective fear seeks an outlet. The first significant massacre occurred in Toulon, France, in April of 1348. A mob attacked the Jewish quarter, killing 40 people. Similar violence spread rapidly northward through France, reaching the German states by the summer. In Strasbourg on February 14th, 1349, Valentine's Day, though the date wouldn't carry romantic associations for several more centuries, authorities burned approximately 2,000 Jews alive on a wooden platform constructed for the purpose. The victims included men, women, and children. Some had been offered the chance to convert to Christianity and save themselves. Most refused, choosing death over betraying their faith. The Strasbourg massacre wasn't an eruption of spontaneous violence. It was a deliberate, organised killing conducted with the cooperation, sometimes the active leadership of civic authorities. The city council had initially tried to protect the Jewish community, but guild representatives and others demanded action. When the council continued to resist, they were simply removed from office and replaced with officials willing to carry out the murders. This pattern repeated across dozens of towns and cities throughout the German-speaking lands. Local officials sometimes tried to protect Jewish communities, motivated by economic self-interest. Jews paid substantial taxes and fees. Moral conviction, or simple recognition that the accusations were absurd, but popular pressure, often orchestrated by flagellant groups, guilds, or debtors eager to escape their obligations to Jewish creditors, typically overwhelmed these protective impulses. The Pope himself, Clement VI, issued multiple bulls condemning the persecution and explicitly rejecting the well-poisoning accusations as baseless. He pointed out that Jews were dying from plague like everyone else, that areas without Jews were affected equally, and that the accusations contradicted basic logic. His intervention saved some Jewish communities in papal territories, but had limited effect elsewhere, demonstrating the limits of papal authority in the face of mass hysteria. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind the massacres. Economic factors clearly played a role. Killing Jews conveniently eliminated debts owed to Jewish creditors, and property confiscated from murdered Jews enriched various parties. Religious anti-Semitism, deeply embedded in medieval Christian culture, despite official church prohibitions against violence, provided ideological justification. The psychological need to find someone to blame for catastrophe, to impose human agency on natural disaster, created the emotional fuel. The flagellant connection deserves particular attention. Many flagellant processions moved directly from scenes of self-torture to attacks on Jewish quarters, their religious fervour channeled into murderous violence. The theological logic connecting self-punishment for Christian sins with punishment of the Jews who had killed Christ wasn't straightforward, but theological logic wasn't really the point. The flagellants represented a breakdown of normal social restraints, and that breakdown enabled violence that would otherwise have been contained. Some Jewish communities were warned of approaching danger and fled before mobs arrived. Others were protected by local lords who valued them as subjects and saw the accusations for the nonsense they were. A few successfully defended themselves, at least temporarily, against attack, but the overall death toll was staggering, impossible to calculate precisely, but certainly in the tens of thousands across Europe. The aftermath was complicated. Some Jewish communities were eventually invited to return by authorities who recognised their economic value. Others never recovered. The Jewish presence in certain regions was permanently diminished. The trauma embedded itself in Jewish collective memory, joining earlier persecutions in a history of suffering that would continue for centuries. You might witness such violence depending on where you find yourself during the plague years. You might see your neighbours transformed into a mob, people you've known for years suddenly capable of murder, their fear and grief finding release in the suffering of others. Or you might be among those who resist, who hide refugees, who stand against the tide of hatred, knowing that such stands carry risks of their own. The plague kills indiscriminately, but human cruelty chooses its victims with care. The tragedy within the tragedy is that people facing death found energy to inflict death on others, that suffering produced more suffering rather than compassion, that the shared vulnerability of plague somehow intensified rather than diminished the divisions between communities. There's no comfortable moral to draw from this. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death simply happened, driven by forces that remain uncomfortably recognisable in modern contexts. Fear creates scapegoats. Scapegoats suffer, and the plague keeps spreading regardless, indifferent to human blame-casting, killing accusers and accused with equal efficiency. You survive the plague by luck, by location, by the mysterious resilience of your particular immune system. You survive human cruelty the same way, if you're lucky, if you're in the right place, if circumstances favour you rather than destroy you. Both forms of survival feel equally arbitrary, equally unearned, equally haunted by the ghosts of those who didn't survive. The countryside calls to you with promises that city walls cannot make. Clean air, open space, distance from the pressing masses where plague seems to breed and spread. All around you, those who can are fleeing urban centres for rural refuges, and the question of whether to join them weighs heavily as another neighbour's door receives its marking. Another cart rolls past, loaded with bodies wrapped in shrouds. Rural life during the medieval period wasn't the bucolic paradise that city dwellers sometimes imagined. The work was hard, the comforts few, the isolation genuine. But when death stalked the cities with such efficiency, the countryside's disadvantages started looking like advantages. Fewer people meant fewer opportunities for disease transmission. Scattered farmsteads meant natural quarantine. The very poverty that made rural life difficult might also make it survivable. The great literary monument to this flight pattern is Boccaccio's Decameron, written during or shortly after the Black Death's first wave. The frame story describes 10 young nobles, 7 women and 3 men, who retreat from plague-ravaged Florence to a villa in the hills. There, isolated from the dying city, they spend 10 days telling each other stories, 100 tales in total, creating one of the masterpieces of world literature as a way of passing the time while waiting out the pestilence. The Decameron's frame reveals both the appeal and the privilege of rural flight. The 10 protagonists are wealthy enough to have a country house available, provisioned enough to survive without regular contact with markets or suppliers, and young enough to face the boredom of isolation with the creative energy that produces storytelling. Most people fleeing the cities had none of these advantages. Still, the impulse to seek rural sanctuary was widespread. Wealthy families with country estates departed early, bringing servants, supplies, and whatever movable wealth they could transport. These migrations sometimes proved successful. Isolated estates that cut themselves off completely from outside contact sometimes escaped plague entirely. Other times the disease arrived anyway, carried by the very refugees who thought they were escaping it. Middle-class families without country property sought refuge with rural relatives, straining the hospitality of cousins and in-laws who might not have been happy to see them, even without the disease risk they potentially carried. Village communities that had previously welcomed occasional visitors from the city suddenly viewed urban refugees with suspicion and hostility. Some villages posted guards to turn away strangers, others extracted payment before allowing entry. Still others accepted refugees and paid the price when plague followed. Historians still argue about the actual effectiveness of rural flight as a survival strategy. The data is difficult to interpret because plague mortality records are incomplete, because the populations of rural areas before and after the plague are hard to estimate, and because so many variables influenced outcomes in different locations. What's clear is that some rural areas were devastated while others were spared, and that flight was neither a guaranteed protection nor a guaranteed failure. The countryside had its own vulnerabilities. Village life wasn't as densely packed as urban life, but it wasn't isolated in the modern sense either. People gathered at churches, at markets, at festivals that brought communities together in ways that facilitated disease transmission. Manor houses concentrated servants and agricultural workers in close quarters, and once plague entered a small village, the limited population meant that proportional losses could be even higher than in cities. A village of 200 losing half its population was as dead as a city of 200,000 losing half of its population, but the village had less capacity to recover. Rural areas also lacked many resources that cities possessed. Physicians, such as they were, concentrated in urban centres. Villages might have at best a travelling barber surgeon, or a wise woman with herbal knowledge. Churches and monasteries that could organise relief efforts existed mainly in towns. The administrative capacity to implement quarantine measures, to record deaths, to maintain basic social order, all of this was weaker in the countryside. What rural areas offered was space, the physical distance between households that made the fleet rat to human transmission cycle harder to sustain. The separation of communities that could turn one village's outbreak into an isolated tragedy rather than the beginning of a regional catastrophe. You might decide to flee. You gather what possessions you can carry, bid farewell to neighbours who are staying, and set off down roads crowded with others making the same desperate calculation. The journey itself is dangerous. The countryside isn't empty but filled with other refugees, some of whom might be carrying the very disease you're trying to escape. Or you might decide to stay in the city, reasoning that familiar walls offer more security than unknown roads, that your networks of support and knowledge exist here, rather than in some distant village where you'd be a stranger. The people who stay aren't necessarily braver or more foolish than those who flee, they're just making different bets about which choice gives them better odds of survival. Either way, the choice isn't between safety and danger, it's between different types of danger, different gambles, different ways of rolling dice, that the plague will eventually gather regardless of which table you choose. The rural countryside waits with its open spaces and its hidden risks. The city streets continue their daily toll of deaths. Somewhere between these options lies the best chance of survival, but nobody knows exactly where that somewhere is. You make your choice, or circumstances make it for you, and the future unfolds from that moment in ways you cannot predict. For those with sufficient resources and sufficient determination, the most extreme survival strategy was to simply disappear, to seal yourself and your household inside your home and wait for the plague to pass, cutting all contact with the outside world and trusting in your stockpiles to sustain you through whatever duration the pestilence required. This was quarantine taken to its logical extreme, not merely avoiding the obviously sick, but avoiding everyone, treating all human contact as potentially fatal until the danger had definitively passed. The strategy required wealth, enough to stockpile food, fuel and other necessities for months of isolation, and it required social position sufficient to make such isolation sustainable. A craftsman couldn't disappear for 6 months without losing his livelihood. A noble with rents from rural estates could withdraw, and still expect income to continue flowing. The most famous literary depiction of this strategy appears in Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, written nearly 5 centuries after the Black Death, but clearly inspired by it. In that story, a prince and his 1,000 courtiers seal themselves in an abbey, living in luxurious isolation while plague decimates the world outside. The story ends badly. Plague arrives anyway, in a single night killing everyone. But the strategy itself reflects real historical practice. Contemporary accounts describe wealthy families who walled up their urban homes, leaving only small windows through which provisions could be passed. They hired servants to remain outside, purchasing food, gathering news, and passing supplies through these openings without entering themselves. The servants, presumably, were considered expendable. Their potential exposure to plague while running errands was simply the price of keeping the family safe. Other families retreated to country estates as discussed earlier, but then went further, cutting off contact with local villages, dismissing servants who might bring infection from outside, and maintaining a perimeter of isolation around the property itself. Some accounts describe families who burned any letters received, fearing that paper could carry pestilential corruption. Others who refused to accept even food from outside sources, relying entirely on what could be produced within their property boundaries. These extreme isolation strategies sometimes worked. Families who successfully maintained quarantine for the duration of local outbreaks sometimes emerged to find their communities devastated, but themselves unharmed. The strategy was essentially perfect for preventing plague transmission. If you never encountered infected fleas, infected people, or contaminated materials, you couldn't contract the disease. But perfect isolation was nearly impossible to maintain. The provisions you'd stockpiled had to come from somewhere originally, and those somewhere included markets where infected people shopped, warehouses where infected rats nested, shipping routes that carried the disease alongside grain and wine. The servants maintaining your household might have been exposed before they entered service. The very walls of your house might harbour rats whose fleas had already taken up residence. Historians still argue about how many families actually attempted extreme isolation versus how many simply fled to country estates with less rigorous quarantine protocols. The documentation is incomplete because, by definition, successfully isolated households weren't producing records that circulated in the wider world. The psychological costs of isolation appear in various accounts. Families who spent months sealed away from normal social contact experienced depression, anxiety, and the particular madness of small groups living too close together for too long without relief. Children grew up strange, deprived of normal socialization. Marriages strained under pressures that would have been diluted by external activities and friendships. The boredom alone could become unbearable, month after month of the same walls, the same faces, the same conversations, while the world outside experienced events you could only learn about second-hand. And always the fear that your isolation might have been breached, that the disease might already be inside, that you might have sacrificed normal life for nothing. A cough from a family member would trigger panic. A fever, even an ordinary fever, would raise the spectre of buboes forming just beneath the skin. The hypervigilance required to maintain isolation could itself become a form of illness, a constant state of stress that compromised immune systems and mental health alike. You might find yourself in such a household, wealthy enough to attempt isolation, frightened enough to accept its costs. The gates are sealed. The servants outside have been given their instructions. The food supplies, carefully inventoried, should last 6 months if everyone is careful. The first day passes in nervous adjustment. The first week brings a strange kind of peace, the noise of the outside world muted, the immediate dangers held at bay by solid walls. The first month tests patience, but confirms that the strategy is working. News from outside tells of mounting deaths while your household remains healthy. But then comes the second month, and the third, and the news continues to be terrible, and the duration stretches from temporary inconvenience toward indefinite purgatory. How long will you wait? How long can you wait? The pestilence shows no sign of ending, and your supplies won't last forever, and the walls that protect you also imprison you in a way that starts to feel unbearable. This is survival, perhaps, survival of a kind. But it's also a suspension of life, a withdrawal from the world that leaves you wondering whether what you're preserving is worth the preservation. The walls hold, the gates remain sealed. Outside, the bells continue to toll. The breakdown begins gradually, then accelerates until suddenly the world you knew has vanished, and something else, something unrecognizable, has taken its place. Social order, that invisible fabric of expectations and obligations that holds communities together, proves far more fragile than anyone imagined when plague tears through with sufficient force. You notice the small things first. The baker who always opened at dawn now opens irregularly, if at all, because half his apprentices have died and the other half have fled. The market that once filled the square with noise and commerce now attracts only a handful of sellers, hawking goods at prices that would have been criminal a year ago. The watchmen who patrolled the streets at night have largely stopped appearing, Who wants to risk plague exposure for a watchman's wages when so many higher paid positions have become available due to mortality among the holders? Then come the bigger breakdowns. The courts that settle disputes have closed, judges and lawyers have died or fled, and in any case, the dockets are overwhelmed with plague-related cases that no one has time to hear. The guilds that regulated trades and maintained quality standards have lost so many members that enforcement has become impossible. The church that structured time through its calendar of feast days and holy obligations now struggles to maintain basic services. Too many priests have died, and those who remain are stretched thin across parishes that have merged out of necessity. Contemporary accounts describe cities where bodies lay unburied for days because gravediggers had died or demanded wages no one could afford. Others describe houses sealed with entire families dead inside, nobody willing to enter and deal with the remains. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani was writing an account of the plague when he died from it himself, his manuscript ending mid-sentence, a silence more eloquent than any completed description. The normal rules that governed behaviour began to seem irrelevant. What was the point of maintaining reputation when half the people who might judge you were dead? What was the point of building for the future when the future had become so radically uncertain? Some people responded by withdrawing into religious fervour, convinced that the end times had arrived. Others responded by abandoning religious restraint, reasoning that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well enjoy what pleasures remained available. Boccaccio describes Florentines who swung between these extremes, some living temperately and avoiding all superfluity, others drinking excessively and enjoying life to the full, because nothing seemed to matter anymore. The city, he writes, was filled with people who roamed day and night, going from tavern to tavern, drinking without restraint or measure, consuming in weeks what their families had accumulated over generations. Property relations became confused. Houses stood empty after entire families died, and the question of who inherited when there were no surviving relatives was often resolved simply by whoever moved in first. Debts became uncollectible when creditors and debtors alike succumbed. Contracts made before the plague proved impossible to fulfill when the people who were supposed to fulfill them had vanished. The labour market for those who survived transformed almost overnight. Before the plague, labourers were plentiful and cheap, too many people competing for too few positions, keeping wages low and employers firmly in control. After the plague, with perhaps a third of the population dead, suddenly workers could demand wages that would have been unthinkable before. Peasants who had been bound to particular lords began to move in search of better conditions, knowing their labour was desperately needed everywhere. This upheaval would have long-term consequences for European feudalism, but in the immediate crisis, it simply meant that the old hierarchies were crumbling. You navigate this dissolving world as best you can, old certainties no longer apply, old relationships have been severed by death or disrupted by chaos. The neighbour who would have helped you in normal times is dead, or fled, or so consumed by their own survival concerns that they have nothing to spare. Historians still argue about how complete this social breakdown really was. Some accounts may exaggerate for dramatic effect. Chroniclers prone to moralising may have emphasised the negative to make theological points about sin and punishment. Other evidence suggests that many communities maintained remarkable cohesion, even through the worst of the plague, that institutions adapted rather than collapsed, that most people continued to behave more or less normally most of the time. The truth probably lies somewhere between total collapse and perfect continuity, a world that continued to function, but in degraded form, with gaps where functioning stopped entirely and patches where normal life somehow persisted. The experience varied enormously by location, by timing, by the particular community's resources and leadership. What you can say with confidence is that the social world you knew before the plague is not the social world you'll know after, regardless of whether you survive. Even if every institution technically continues, even if every role gets filled by someone, the continuity is broken. The new world will be built on foundations laid during this crisis, by survivors whose experiences will shape everything that follows. The bells still ring when someone is left to ring them. The market still opens when anyone has goods to sell. The courts will eventually reconvene with new judges and new priorities, but the world that will emerge from this crucible of death and disorder will be fundamentally different from the world that entered it. You're not just surviving a disease, you're surviving the end of one era and the beginning of another. Amid the dying and the fleeing, some people stayed. Some people walked toward the plague rather than away from it, knowing the danger, accepting the risk, choosing to care for the sick, even when that care likely meant their own death. These figures, the nurses, the priests, the family members who refused to abandon their loved ones, represent something that statistics about mortality rates cannot capture: the persistence of human compassion even in the darkest circumstances. The Church, for all its failures during the plague, also produced genuine heroes. Many parish priests remained at their posts when they could easily have fled, administering last rites to the dying, offering confession to those who believed their eternal souls depended on it, burying the dead when no one else would touch the bodies. The mortality rate among clergy was catastrophic, precisely because so many of them refused to abandon their duties. Contemporary accounts preserve the names of some of these faithful servants. In Tournai, the bishop reportedly went personally to 10 plague victims, contracting the disease and dying, but inspiring others to similar service. In countless parishes whose names have been forgotten, priests died performing their duties and were replaced by new priests who died in turn, an endless succession of sacrifice that kept the sacraments available to the faithful even as death closed in. Not all clergy behaved so admirably, of course. Some fled at the first sign of danger, others demanded outrageous fees for services that were supposed to be free. The cynical and the cowardly existed alongside the courageous and the devoted, and the plague revealed character with brutal efficiency. There's nothing like a test that might kill you to sort out what you really believe. Religious orders, particularly the mendicant friars, Franciscans, Dominicans and others, suffered enormous losses while providing care to plague victims. These orders had traditionally served the poor and the sick as part of their religious mission, and they continued that service during the plague at tremendous cost. Some monasteries lost half or more of their members, others were wiped out entirely. Women played crucial roles in caring for the sick, though their contributions are less well documented than men's. Nuns in nursing orders continued their work. Secular women cared for sick family members when male relatives had fled or died. The unnamed and unnumbered women who served as informal nurses and midwives and caretakers took on plague patients alongside their normal duties. Their mortality was probably as high as that of male caregivers, but medieval record-keeping rarely distinguished them. Families faced impossible choices: stay with a dying spouse, parent or child and risk joining them in death? Flee and survive with the knowledge that you abandoned someone who needed you? The plague forced these choices on millions of people, and there was no answer that avoided guilt. Survival often meant abandonment, and loyalty often meant death. Historians still argue about how common family abandonment actually was. Some contemporary accounts describe shocking levels of callousness: parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents, spouses leaving each other to die alone. Other accounts emphasize the persistence of family bonds, the heroism of those who stayed, the networks of care that continued functioning even when professional caregivers had fled. The truth, again, probably involves enormous variation. Some families held together through the crisis, nursing their sick, burying their dead, supporting their survivors. Other families shattered, each member pursuing individual survival without regard for the others. Most families probably fell somewhere between these extremes, making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, regretting some choices and being proud of others, surviving or dying regardless of their virtue. Care for the sick during plague took particular courage because medieval understanding of disease transmission, while wrong in its details, correctly identified proximity as dangerous. You couldn't care for a plague victim from across the room. You had to get close, to change soiled bedding, to lance buboes, to cool fevered brows with damp cloths, to hold shaking bodies through the deliriums of high fever. Every act of care was an act of potential self-infection. Did caregiving change survival rates? Probably not much, given the absence of effective treatments. Patients who received care died at rates similar to patients who were abandoned. The disease simply couldn't be cured by medieval medicine. But care affected how people died. A comforted death, surrounded by love, with spiritual needs attended to and physical suffering eased as much as possible, was different from an abandoned death, alone and terrified, without the rituals that were supposed to ease passage to the next world. You might find yourself in this position, caring for someone you love, watching them die despite everything you do, knowing that your presence puts your own life at risk. Or you might be the one being cared for, seeing your caregivers fear and their love, knowing what your illness costs them, unable to release them from the obligation that is probably going to kill them. These are the moments that reveal what human beings are capable of, not the flight and the fear and the violence, but the quiet courage of staying, of caring, of being present for another person's suffering when presence itself is dangerous. The plague takes whom it takes, but love persists, impractical and dangerous, and stubbornly refusing to calculate odds. The strangest thing about the plague, from the perspective of those living through it, was how randomly it seemed to choose its victims. A husband would die while his wife survived. A child would perish while siblings remained healthy. Entire households would be wiped out while the house next door lost no one. The pattern, if there was a pattern, defied every theory about divine punishment, humoral balance, or miasmatic corruption. We now know that this apparent randomness had causes: genetic variations in immune response, differences in flea exposure, the luck of which bacterial strain you encountered. But medieval observers could only wonder at a disease that seemed to mock the very idea of causation. Some people survived infection. They developed buboes, suffered terrible fevers, passed through the valley of the shadow of death, and somehow emerged on the other side. These survivors often found themselves immune to subsequent infection, at least for the immediate future. They became valuable. They could tend the sick without much fear. They could handle the bodies of the dead. They could enter houses that others refused to approach. What made some people survive while others died? Modern genetics has begun to answer this question, though much remains unknown. Researchers have identified specific genetic variations that affect immune response to Yersinia pestis, and some of these variations are more common in populations whose ancestors were exposed to plague. The descendants of Black Death survivors carry genetic signatures of that survival, a biological inheritance of resistance that may still provide some protection against plague infection today. But genetics wasn't the only factor. The form of disease mattered enormously. Bubonic plague, while horrible, had a significant survival rate. Perhaps 30 to 50% of untreated cases recovered. Septicemic and pneumonic forms were far more lethal, often approaching 100% mortality. A person whose infection remained localized in the lymph nodes had a fighting chance. A person whose bacteria reached the bloodstream or lungs was almost certainly doomed. The size of the initial bacterial dose probably mattered too. Multiple flea bites delivering large numbers of bacteria would overwhelm immune systems that might have successfully fought off smaller invasions. General health at the time of infection affected outcomes. Those who were well nourished and previously healthy had better chances than those already weakened by other diseases or malnutrition. Age played a role, though not in the straightforward pattern you might expect. Some evidence suggests that the healthiest adults died at particularly high rates because their vigorous immune responses caused dangerous inflammatory reactions. Historians still argue about whether certain behaviours or characteristics protected against plague. Did people who lived in certain types of housing fare better? Did people who practiced particular dietary habits survive more often? Did social class affect mortality beyond its effects on nutrition and living conditions? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete, and much of it contradicts itself. What medieval observers noticed was simply who survived, and they drew conclusions that may or may not have been accurate. A family that practiced strict isolation and survived attributed their survival to that isolation, even if luck played a larger role. A village that performed particularly fervent prayers and escaped the plague credited prayer, even if their geographical isolation was the actual factor. A physician whose patients recovered more often than expected credited his treatments, even if those patients happened to have better genetics or were infected with less virulent strains. The survivors emerged into a transformed world. Their immunity gave them practical advantages. They could move freely through plague-stricken areas, they could take over the businesses and properties of the dead, they could marry into families that had lost members. But survival also carried psychological burdens. Why had they lived when so many others had died? What special virtue or luck protected them while their neighbours perished? Survivor's guilt, though the concept wouldn't be named for centuries, affected many who emerged from the plague. The immunity wasn't necessarily permanent. While recovered individuals generally resisted reinfection in the short term, plague returned repeatedly over the following centuries, and previous survival was no guarantee of future survival. The bacteria evolved, immune responses waned, and luck remained luck, unpredictable and unfair. You might be among the survivors. You develop the symptoms, pass through the terror and the agony, feel life slipping away, and then somehow, impossibly, begin to recover. The fever breaks, the buboes drain, strength slowly returns to limbs that you thought would never move again. You're alive, you don't know why. Your neighbour, who seemed just as strong, who prayed just as fervently, who tried just as hard to fight the disease, is dead. The logic that would explain your survival while justifying their death doesn't exist. The randomness is absolute. But you're alive, and the world needs people who are alive, and there's work to be done. As you consider what might have protected some people while leaving others vulnerable, you naturally wonder about the factors that could be controlled. The choices people made about how to live their daily lives. Did diet matter? Did hygiene help? Did certain habits offer protection that no one at the time understood? Medieval diet varied enormously by class, region, and season. The wealthy ate meat, white bread, and imported delicacies. The poor ate dark bread, pottage, a kind of vegetable stew, and whatever protein they could obtain through fishing, poaching, or keeping small animals. Vegetables and fruits appeared seasonally. Preservation through salting, smoking, and drying extended availability but altered nutritional content. Modern understanding suggests that nutritional status affected plague outcomes in complex ways. Well-nourished individuals might have mounted stronger immune responses, potentially improving survival rates, or might have experienced more severe inflammatory reactions, potentially worsening outcomes. Malnourished individuals might have lacked the resources to fight infection effectively, or might have had dampened immune responses that paradoxically reduced some complications. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. What dietary practices might have offered genuine protection? Consuming garlic and onions, commonly recommended during plague times, wouldn't have prevented infection but might have had mild antimicrobial effects. Avoiding spoiled food, sound advice regardless of plague, prevented other illnesses that might have weakened people's ability to resist Yersinia pestis. Adequate protein intake supported immune function, but nothing in the medieval diet could have specifically prevented plague transmission, which required avoiding infected fleas rather than eating particular foods. Hygiene is a more complicated question. Medieval people weren't as filthy as popular imagination suggests. Bathing was more common than later Victorian moralizers like to admit, and standards of cleanliness existed even if they differed from modern expectations. But the aspects of hygiene that would have mattered most for plague prevention weren't understood or practiced. Hand washing with soap removes bacteria and other pathogens, but medieval people didn't know about bacteria and didn't have access to effective soap in the modern sense. Keeping living spaces free of rodents would have reduced flea populations, but rats were ubiquitous in medieval environments, and controlling them was extremely difficult with available methods. Laundering clothing at high temperatures could have killed fleas, but heating water was expensive and time-consuming, limiting how often most people could wash their clothes. Some practices that medieval people would have considered hygienic may have actually been counterproductive. The belief that bathing opened the pores to pestilential vapours led some authorities to recommend avoiding baths during plague times, which probably increased flea loads on human bodies. The practice of burning aromatic substances to purify air was harmless at best, wasteful at worst, since air quality had nothing to do with plague transmission. Historians still argue about whether any lifestyle factors significantly affected plague survival rates. The evidence mostly suggests that individual choices mattered far less than factors outside individual control: geographic location, population density, the particular strains of bacteria circulating in an area, and genetic resistance that individuals either possessed or lacked through no effort of their own. This is a hard truth for both medieval and modern people to accept. We want to believe that good choices protect us, that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished, that taking care of ourselves makes a meaningful difference. The plague's brutal randomness challenged these comforting assumptions, suggesting instead that death could claim the careful and the careless with equal ease. What daily choices might you have made during the plague years? Perhaps you bathed less frequently, following medical advice about the dangers of open pores. Perhaps you carried aromatic herbs, hoping their smell would protect you from corrupt air. Perhaps you avoided crowded places, and this at least probably helped by reducing your exposure to infected individuals and their fleas. You ate what you could afford, lived in the conditions your resources permitted, followed the health advice that authorities provided, and hoped for the best. The relationship between your choices and your survival was essentially unknowable. You might have done everything right and still died, You might have done everything wrong and still survived. This uncertainty is itself a psychological burden. The inability to know whether your efforts mean anything, whether your care and caution will reward you, or whether fate will ignore them entirely. You do what you can because doing nothing feels unbearable. You take the precautions that seem sensible, follow the advice that seems credible, make the choices that give you some sense of control over circumstances that are fundamentally uncontrollable. And then you wait, like everyone else, to see what happens. The real killers, the actual mechanisms by which plague spread from person to person and place to place, remained completely invisible to everyone living through the Black Death. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of the whole tragedy. The enemy was hiding in plain sight, or rather in plain smell, scurrying through the shadows while humans blamed everything from bad air to divine wrath to Jewish conspiracies. Rats, fleas, bacteria. This trilogy of transmission was right there, in every medieval home, in every ship's hold, in every granary and stable and marketplace. But without microscopes, without germ theory, without the conceptual framework to even imagine that invisible organisms could cause disease, medieval people had no way to identify the actual threat. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was ubiquitous in medieval Europe. These weren't the larger brown rats that would later become dominant. Black rats were smaller, more agile, more inclined to live in close proximity to humans. They nested in walls, in thatch roofs, in stored grain, in the holds of ships. They were so common that nobody particularly noticed them. They were simply part of the environment, like dust or darkness. The rats themselves didn't directly transmit plague to humans. Instead, they served as hosts for the rat flea, Xenophila chiopes, which was the actual vector. When a rat became infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria multiplied in the flea's gut, eventually blocking it. The blocked flea became increasingly desperate for a blood meal, biting more frequently but unable to feed properly. When a blocked flea bit a new host, another rat or a human, it regurgitated bacteria-laden material into the bite wound, transmitting the infection. When rat populations crashed due to plague die-offs, because rats were dying from the disease too, their fleas sought new hosts. Humans, warm and available, became the next meal. This dynamic helps explain why plague outbreaks often began with high rat mortality before human cases appeared. Observers at the time sometimes noted that rats were dying in unusual numbers just before human plague emerged, though they didn't understand the connection. Human-to-human transmission could also occur, particularly with pneumonic plague. An infected person with the bacteria in their lungs would cough or sneeze, projecting droplets containing bacteria that others might inhale. This respiratory route was far more dangerous than flea-borne transmission, because it didn't require rat intermediaries and could spread rapidly through crowded spaces. Some historians have proposed alternative transmission models for the Black Death, suggesting that the pattern of spread doesn't quite match what would be expected from a purely flea-borne epidemic. They point to the speed of transmission, the winter outbreaks when flea activity should have been reduced, and other anomalies. The debate continues. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was caused by exactly the same pathogen as modern plague or whether some variant or additional pathogen might have been involved. What's clear is that medieval people had no way to know any of this. Their anti-plague measures addressed the wrong targets. Bad air instead of infected fleas, corrupt humours instead of bacterial infection, divine wrath instead of disease ecology. The treatments they tried either did nothing or made things worse. The preventive measures they took were essentially random. Some accidentally helped by reducing flea exposure, others did nothing, others actively harmed by bringing people together in ways that facilitated transmission. You walk through a plague-stricken town, stepping over dead rats without thinking twice about them, shooing fleas from your clothing as a minor annoyance, breathing deeply because fresh air is supposed to be healthful. You have no way to know that your real enemies are smaller than your eye can see, that they're travelling on animals you've been trained to ignore, that the bites you scratch absent-mindedly might be delivering death to your bloodstream. The invisibility of the true cause made the plague feel supernatural. How else could you explain a disease that struck without warning, that spread without apparent contact, that killed some while sparing others for no discernible reason? The medieval explanations, God's wrath, astrological influences, poisoned air were wrong, but they weren't unreasonable given the available information. They were attempts to impose meaning on a phenomenon that seemed to defy all natural law. We have advantages they lacked. We know about bacteria and fleas and transmission routes. We have antibiotics that can treat plague if caught early. We have public health infrastructure that can identify outbreaks and implement effective containment. But the humility that comes from understanding what medieval people faced, the genuine impossibility of their situation, the blindness imposed by the limits of their knowledge, reminds us that our own understanding is also limited, that future generations may look back at our confident explanations and find them as touching and inadequate as we find humoral theory. The rats continue to scurry, the fleas continue to bite, and the bacteria, utterly indifferent to human theories about why they kill, continue their ancient biological work. The worst of it passes. The death rate, which had been climbing relentlessly, begins to slow. Then it stops climbing. Then, impossibly, it begins to decline. The bells that had tolled constantly now ring less often. The carts that collected bodies make smaller rounds. Something has changed. The Black Death's first wave, the great mortality that swept Europe from 1347 to roughly 1351, was ending. Not because humans had developed effective treatments or preventive measures, they hadn't, but because the disease had run its natural course. The most susceptible had died. Those with genetic resistance had survived. The bacterial strains had burned through available hosts and reached a kind of terrible equilibrium. This was not the end of plague. It was merely the end of the beginning. Plague would return to Europe repeatedly over the following centuries. Major outbreaks struck in the 1360s, the 1370s, and with decreasing but still significant intensity throughout the 1400s, 1500s, and beyond. The Great Plague of London in 1665, more than 300 years after the Black Death, killed an estimated 100,000 people. The last major European outbreak occurred in Marseille in 1720, though isolated cases continued to appear sporadically. Each return of plague was less devastating than the one before, though still terrible by any reasonable standard. Populations that had been culled of their most susceptible members proved somewhat more resistant. Public health measures, quarantine, isolation, cordons sanitaires, became more sophisticated with each outbreak, and the intervals between outbreaks allowed populations to recover, building demographic reserves that could absorb significant mortality without collapsing. For those living through the 1350s, though, the pattern of recurring plague was not yet established. The relief of surviving the first wave was genuine and overwhelming. People emerged from isolation, from flight, from the paralyzing fear that had gripped communities for years. They counted their dead, buried those who remained unburied, and began the slow process of piecing their lives back together. The emotional transition was complicated, relief mixed with grief. The joy of personal survival existed alongside the sorrow of losing family and friends. The future that had seemed foreclosed during the worst of the plague now reopened, but it was a different future than anyone had imagined. A future with fewer people, disrupted institutions, and traumatic memories that would take generations to fade. Some people reacted to survival with renewed religious devotion, interpreting their preservation as evidence of divine favour that demanded appropriate gratitude. Others reacted with hedonistic abandon, reasoning that life's brevity and unpredictability argued for enjoying pleasures while they remained available. Most people, probably, experienced some mixture of both impulses, heightened appreciation for life alongside persistent anxiety about its fragility. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of the Black Death on European civilization. Some see it as a fundamental trauma that undermined faith in institutions, accelerated social change, and contributed to the individualism that would eventually characterize the Renaissance and Reformation. Others argue that the psychological impact has been exaggerated, that medieval people were more resilient than we give them credit for, that life returned to something like normal relatively quickly. What's clear is that the return of plague changed everything again. Just as communities were beginning to recover, just as survivors were starting to rebuild, the disease came back. The 1361 outbreak, sometimes called the Plague of Children, because it hit younger generations who hadn't been exposed to the first wave particularly hard, reminded everyone that the monster wasn't dead, merely sleeping. You might experience this cycle multiple times in your lifetime. The plague arrives, devastates, passes. You begin to hope. Years go by. You start to forget, or at least to suppress, the worst memories. And then the bells begin tolling again, the carts begin rolling again, and the whole nightmare recommences. Living with endemic plague meant living with uncertainty as a permanent condition. You could never know when the next outbreak would arrive, how severe it would be, whether you would survive this time as you had survived before. The immunity that protected you once might not protect you again. The precautions that worked before might fail. The luck that had favoured you might run out. This ongoing uncertainty shapes something fundamental about post-plague European psychology. The death reminders become constant, in art, in literature, in religious practice, in the way people think about time and mortality and the purpose of existence. We'll explore these cultural expressions in later sections, but for now, simply note that the Black Death wasn't a single event from which recovery was possible. It was a new condition of life, a permanent shadow that would darken European existence for centuries to come. The plague recedes. Relief washes over you. But somewhere in the back of your mind you know it will return. The survivors inherit a transformed world. With perhaps a third of Europe's population dead, the mathematical realities of labour, land and wealth have shifted in ways that will take generations to fully work out. You emerge from the plague years into an economy that no longer operates by the rules you learned. Before the Black Death, labour was cheap and land was the primary source of wealth. Too many people competed for too few opportunities, keeping wages low and reinforcing the power of landowners over the peasants who worked their fields. A peasant who disliked his conditions couldn't easily leave. There were plenty of others desperate to take his place, and feudal obligations often bound him legally to the land anyway. After the plague, this equation inverted. Suddenly there weren't enough workers to cultivate all the available land. Crops rotted in fields because no one remained to harvest them. Livestock wandered untended because their keepers had died. The lords who had always held the upper hand in negotiations with labourers found themselves competing for workers who could now demand better wages, better conditions, and freedoms that would have been unthinkable before. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in England in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and require workers to accept employment from any lord who offered it. Similar legislation appeared across Europe as ruling classes attempted to preserve their pre-plague advantages through law. These efforts largely failed. You can't legislate away basic economic forces, and when labour is genuinely scarce, workers will find ways to command higher prices regardless of what the law says. Peasant unrest grew throughout the post-plague decades, culminating in uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and the French Jacquerie of 1358. These rebellions were suppressed, often brutally, but the underlying economic shifts continued regardless. The feudal system that had dominated European society for centuries began its long decline, eroded by plague-induced labour shortages that made the old arrangements unsustainable. For individual survivors, the economic transformation created both opportunities and dislocations. Those who survived could claim abandoned properties, take over businesses left without heirs, marry into families that had lost members and consolidated their wealth among fewer descendants. A peasant who survived might find himself working land that had formerly supported 5 families with leverage to negotiate favourable terms from lords desperate for any workers at all. Historians still argue about whether the Black Death was the primary cause of feudalism's decline, or whether it merely accelerated processes already underway. Economic systems are complex, and attributing major changes to single causes is always risky. But the correlation between plague mortality and increased peasant mobility and bargaining power is clear enough that most historians accept at least a significant connection. The institutional landscape also shifted. Monasteries and religious houses that had lost too many members to sustain themselves merged or closed entirely. Universities struggled with depleted faculties and reduced enrolments. The church, having lost perhaps half its clergy to plague, faced a quality crisis as positions were filled by hastily trained replacements who might lack the education and dedication of their predecessors. The political implications took longer to become clear, but they were substantial. The consolidation of a land in fewer hands, the weakening of traditional feudal bonds, the rising power of merchants and artisans who had survived the plague and prospered in its aftermath. All of these would eventually contribute to the development of centralized nation-states, capitalism, and the political arrangements that would characterize early modern Europe. You navigate these changes as best you can. Perhaps you're a peasant who suddenly finds your labor in demand, able to negotiate wages your parents could never have dreamed of. Perhaps you're a craftsman whose guild has lost so many members that the old restrictions no longer apply, opening opportunities that the pre-plague economy would have foreclosed. Perhaps you're a merchant who has inherited wealth from relatives who died without other heirs, transforming your circumstances overnight. Or perhaps you're a noble watching your world erode, your peasants demanding freedoms you've never granted, your income declining as labour costs rise and rents become harder to collect. The plague doesn't discriminate by class in whom it kills, but its economic aftermath discriminates fiercely by class in whom it benefits. The rebuilding takes decades. Abandoned fields return to forest. Villages that lost too many people to sustain themselves disappear entirely, leaving only archaeological traces for future centuries to discover. The population of Europe won't return to pre-plague levels until the 1500s, 2 centuries of demographic recovery from a single wave of mortality, complicated by recurring plague outbreaks that kept knocking population growth back. But rebuilding does happen. Humans are remarkably resilient, and the survivors of the Black Death proved no exception. They married, had children, rebuilt communities, adapted institutions to new circumstances, and eventually created a world that, while different from what had existed before, was recognisably alive and functioning. You're part of that rebuilding, whether you realise it or not. Every decision you make, where to work, whom to marry, how to invest your labour and your small savings, contributes to the new world rising from the ashes of the old. The physicians who had failed so spectacularly during the Black Death gradually began to question the theories that had guided their failures. This questioning didn't happen overnight. Medical paradigms are remarkably resistant to change, but the plague's devastation had exposed the limits of existing knowledge too clearly to ignore entirely. Humoral theory didn't disappear. It remained the dominant medical framework for centuries, and elements of it persist in modern language. We still describe people as having certain temperaments. But the plague introduced cracks in the theoretical edifice that would eventually widen into the scientific revolution of later centuries. The most immediate medical innovation was the formalization of public health measures. Quarantine, isolation, the tracking of disease spread. These practices had existed informally during the Black Death, but subsequent outbreaks saw them institutionalized. Venice established the first permanent health boards, officials with authority to implement disease control measures during outbreaks. Other cities followed, creating bureaucratic structures that could respond to future crises more effectively than the improvised efforts of 1347. These health boards didn't operate on germ theory, they still believed in miasma and corrupt air. But they observed that isolation worked, that quarantine reduced transmission, that controlling the movement of people and goods from affected areas limited the spread of disease. They didn't know why these measures worked. Their theoretical explanations were completely wrong. But they accumulated practical knowledge that saved lives regardless of the theoretical confusion. The dissection of human bodies, long restricted by religious and cultural prohibitions, became more common in the post-plague centuries. Physicians seeking to understand what plague did to the body needed to examine that body directly, and the sheer number of plague deaths made bodies more available while somewhat normalizing handling of the dead. This wasn't the systematic anatomy that would later develop, but it represented a shift toward observational medicine that would eventually bear fruit. Medical education also evolved. The universities that trained physicians had relied heavily on ancient texts, teaching students what Galen and Hippocrates had written, rather than teaching them to observe patients directly. The plague revealed the inadequacy of this bookish approach. A physician who could recite Galen perfectly still couldn't cure plague, and gradually, very gradually, medical education began to incorporate more practical training alongside theoretical study. Historians still argue about how much the Black Death contributed to medical progress versus how much progress would have occurred anyway through the general intellectual developments of the Renaissance. The counterfactual is impossible to assess. We can't know what would have happened in a plague-free Europe, but the temporal correlation between the Black Death and subsequent medical innovations is suggestive, even if causation remains difficult to establish. The real breakthrough wouldn't come until centuries later. The germ theory of disease, developed in the 19th century by figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, finally provided the correct framework for understanding how infectious diseases actually spread. Antibiotics, developed in the 20th century, provided the first effective treatment for bacterial infections like plague. Modern public health, with its surveillance systems and rapid response capabilities, represents the culmination of lessons learned painfully over centuries of epidemic experience. But the seeds of that modern medical system were planted during the plague years. The practice of quarantine that Venice formalised would be refined over centuries until it became the sophisticated disease control apparatus of modern epidemiology. The health boards that tracked plague spread would evolve into the public health agencies that monitor disease today. The questioning of ancient authority that the plague provoked would eventually lead to the scientific method itself. You, living through these centuries, wouldn't see the culmination. You would see only the failures, the treatments that didn't work, the theories that proved wrong, the people who died despite every effort to save them. The eventual success was too far in the future to offer any comfort. But your experience, and the experiences of millions like you, became part of the accumulated knowledge that humanity slowly built. The failures taught lessons, the observations accumulated, the institutions evolved, and eventually, hundreds of years later, humanity developed the tools to actually fight diseases like plague effectively. Your suffering wasn't meaningless. It was part of a very long story whose ending you couldn't see. The trauma of the Black Death expressed itself in art and literature, with an intensity that would shape European culture for centuries. When words and images tried to capture what had happened, they produced some of the most haunting creations in the history of human expression. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the defining artistic motifs of the late medieval period. In paintings, woodcuts, and eventually printed illustrations, skeletons led living people of all social classes in a grim procession toward death. The Pope and the peasant, the king and the beggar, the bishop and the prostitute, all danced together in death's embrace, their worldly distinctions meaningless before the universal destination. These images served multiple purposes. They reminded viewers of mortality in an era when such reminders hardly seemed necessary. They critiqued social hierarchies by emphasizing that death treated all equally. They provided a framework for processing grief, transforming individual losses into universal truths about the human condition. And they were grimly beautiful, the skeletal figures often depicted with an energy and expressiveness that made death seem almost seductive. The theme appeared in church murals, in manuscript illustrations in the earliest printed books. Some danse macabre depictions included verses in which death addressed each of its dancing partners, explaining why they were being summoned and mocking their earthly pretensions. The Pope's authority couldn't protect him. The merchant's wealth couldn't buy escape. The beautiful woman's appearance would rot in the grave. Literature also grappled with the plague's meaning. Boccaccio's Decameron, mentioned earlier, used the plague as a frame story for 100 tales that range from bawdy comedies to tragic romances. The juxtaposition was deliberately jarring, stories of love and trickery and human folly against a backdrop of mass death, suggesting that life's variety persisted even in catastrophe, that humans would keep telling stories and pursuing desires even as the world collapsed around them. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the decades after the Black Death, depicts a society working through post-plague changes. The pilgrims who tell the tales include representatives of traditional authority, knight, prioress, parson, alongside emerging social types whose prominence reflects post-plague economic shifts. The miller and the reeve, craftsmen and labourers, speak with voices that might not have been heard in pre-plague literature. Religious art took on darker tones. Crucifixion scenes emphasised Christ's suffering with unprecedented graphic detail. Last Judgment paintings depicted the torments awaiting sinners with a vividness that suggested artists had witnessed horrors firsthand. The memento mori tradition, remember that you will die, became pervasive, appearing on tombs, in books of hours, on everyday objects that kept death constantly in view. Historians still argue about how directly the Black Death influenced specific artistic and literary developments. Artistic styles were already evolving before the plague, and would have continued to evolve regardless. But the emotional tone of late medieval art, its fascination with death, its social criticism, its dark humour, seems impossible to explain without reference to the collective trauma of the plague years. Music too reflected the darkness. The plaintive melodies of medieval religious music took on new urgency when sung in half-empty churches by congregations who had lost so many members. Secular music explored themes of mortality and transience with unprecedented directness. The tradition of funerary music developed and expanded to meet the increased demand. For you living through these times, art provided a way to process what no purely rational approach could address. The images of the danse macabre captured something about your experience that theological explanations or medical theories couldn't quite reach. The stories of the Decameron reminded you that life contained more than death, that pleasure and comedy and human connection persisted even against the darkest background. You might commission a tomb monument featuring your own corpse in various stages of decay, a transy tomb, as these macabre memorials were called, not from morbid fixation, but from a realistic acknowledgement of what awaited everybody. You might hang a skull in your chamber as a memento mori, a daily reminder that death could come at any time and that your spiritual preparation should never be delayed. The art of this period isn't comfortable to view. It doesn't offer the consolations of beauty or transcendence that art is often expected to provide. But it's honest, unflinchingly honest, about what humans experienced during the plague years, and how that experience changed their understanding of existence itself. That honesty is its own kind of gift, the gift of being seen, of having one's experience acknowledged, of knowing that future generations would understand what this time felt like, how it looked, what images haunted the minds of those who lived through it. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it transformed the civilization they had built, initiating changes that would ripple through European history for centuries and ultimately help create the modern world. Understanding this legacy requires stepping back from individual survival to consider how an entire society responded to catastrophic loss. The most immediate legacy was demographic. Europe's population dropped by roughly a third, some regions more, some less, and wouldn't recover to pre-plague levels until the mid-1500s. This demographic collapse reshaped everything: economics, politics, religion, culture, even the physical landscape as abandoned villages returned to forest and farmland went untended. The economic consequences were revolutionary. With labour scarce and land abundant, the old feudal arrangements became unsustainable. Peasants gained bargaining power, wages rose. The rigid social hierarchies that had characterised medieval society began to flex and eventually to crack. The economic mobility that would characterise early modern capitalism had roots in the labour market disruptions of the plague years. Religious authority, already challenged by various reform movements, faced new questions it couldn't adequately answer. Why had God permitted such suffering? Why had prayers and processions failed to stop the plague? Why did the righteous die alongside the sinful? The Church maintained its institutional power for centuries after the plague, but the seeds of Protestant Reformation, the questioning of priestly authority, the emphasis on individual faith, the critique of institutional corruption found fertile ground in post-plague psychology. The political landscape shifted as well. Lords who lost too many peasants to maintain their estates sold land, or accepted unfavourable terms from those who remained. Merchants and craftsmen who survived accumulated wealth and influence. The balance of power between rural landed aristocracy and urban commercial classes tilted gradually but persistently toward the towns. The nation-states that would dominate early modern politics began their rise on foundations partly laid by plague disruption. Historians still argue about causation and correlation. The 14th century saw many changes beyond the plague. The 100 Years' War, the Papal Schism, climatic shifts, technological innovations, and disentangling the effects of each factor is genuinely difficult. Some scholars emphasize the plague's transformative impact. Others argue that many changes would have occurred anyway, perhaps more slowly through other mechanisms. What seems clear is that the Black Death accelerated processes already underway while initiating new ones. The weakening of feudal bonds, the rise of merchant capitalism, the questioning of religious authority, the development of public health infrastructure, the psychological shift toward individualism and mortality awareness. All of these had pre-plague precedents, but received enormous impetus from the plague experience. The plague also left a legacy of fear. For centuries after the Black Death, Europeans lived with the knowledge that devastating epidemic could return at any time. This awareness shaped behaviour, influenced policy, and maintained the institutions, quarantine systems, health boards, plague hospitals that had developed in response to the initial outbreak. The fear was justified. Plague did return repeatedly, though never again with the same catastrophic intensity as the first wave. Cultural memory preserved the plague experience across generations. The artistic and literary representations we discussed earlier became part of the common heritage, familiar references that everyone understood, even if their own experience of plague was limited. The danse macabre, the memento mori, the emphasis on death's universality, these motifs persisted long after the immediate trauma had faded, shaping European attitudes toward mortality that would influence everything from philosophy to funeral practices. For you, a survivor, the legacy is personal before it's historical. Your world has changed, your community has been transformed, your understanding of existence has been permanently altered. The institutions and practices that emerge from this crisis will shape the lives of your children and grandchildren, but you experience them first as immediate necessities. The new labour arrangements you negotiate, the religious practices that help you process grief, the public health measures that, sometimes, protect against future outbreaks. You can't see the full scope of what's happening because you're living inside it. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of capitalism, the development of modern medicine, all of these lie in the future, and the connections between them and your plague experience won't be clear for centuries. But you're part of the story nonetheless. Your survival, your adaptations, your choices about how to rebuild, all contribute to the new world rising from the old. History moves through individual lives, and your life, however ordinary it might seem, carries the currents of historical change. The Black Death ends one era and begins another. You stand at the hinge point, looking backward at everything that's been lost and forward at whatever comes next. And now, as our journey together draws toward its close, let us step back from the noise and terror of those plague years and find, in this final section, the quiet lessons that whisper across the centuries to reach us here in the soft darkness of your room as sleep begins to gather at the edges of your awareness. The medieval people who survived the Black Death didn't possess any knowledge we lack today. They couldn't see the bacteria that killed them, couldn't access the treatments we take for granted, couldn't understand the transmission routes that modern epidemiology has mapped so thoroughly. They survived through luck, through genetic resistance they couldn't have known they possessed, through choices that sometimes helped and sometimes made no difference at all. And yet they did survive. Millions of them. Perhaps a majority of those who were exposed to the disease found ways to continue living, to rebuild, to bring children into a world that must have seemed broken beyond repair. The resilience that carried them through those years is the same resilience that has carried humanity through every catastrophe before and since. A stubborn insistence on continuing, on hoping, on believing that tomorrow might be better than today. What can their experience teach us, here in our time, with our own challenges and our own fears? Perhaps first that uncertainty is survivable. The people of the 14th century didn't know what was happening to them, didn't know how long it would last, didn't know whether their actions would save them or doom them. They lived with not knowing in a way that we, with our information abundance, often struggle to accept, and yet they persisted. They made decisions with incomplete information because that was the only option available. They did their best, and sometimes their best was enough. Perhaps also that community matters even when community is dangerous. The plague spread through human contact, but human contact was also what made survival meaningful. The caregivers who tended the sick, the neighbours who shared food when supplies ran low, the religious communities that maintained rituals of mourning and celebration. These connections carried people through the crisis even as they sometimes contributed to the crisis. We are social creatures, and our sociality is both our vulnerability and our strength. Perhaps finally that endings contain beginnings. The Black Death was the end of medieval Europe as it had existed, the end of certain institutions, certain assumptions, certain ways of organising society. But it was also the beginning of what came next. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the world that eventually produced the knowledge and technology that has, for now, tamed plague into a treatable illness rather than an existential threat. You carry the inheritance of those survivors in ways you might not realise. If your ancestry traces through medieval Europe, and if you're listening to this, it probably does somewhere, then your genetic heritage includes whatever resistance factors helped your ancestors survive. You exist because they existed, because their immune systems fought off infection, because their choices about when to flee and when to stay happened to align with survival. But beyond genetics, you carry cultural inheritance as well. The institutions that govern modern medicine, the public health systems that track and respond to disease, the scientific methods that allow us to understand pathogens, all of these trace back through many intermediate steps to lessons learned during the plague years. We know what we know because they died and because those who survived began, slowly, to ask better questions about why. The night grows deeper now around your quiet room. The horrors of the 14th century seem very far away, and they are far away, separated from you by centuries of progress and change and accumulated understanding. The Black Death cannot reach you here, in your comfortable bed, with your access to antibiotics and your knowledge of disease transmission, and your public health infrastructure standing ready to respond to outbreaks before they become catastrophes. Let the images of the plague years fade now, like smoke dissipating into clean air. Let the bells stop tolling, the death carts stop rolling, the flagellants stop their processing through streets that exist now only in memory and historical reconstruction. Let the suffering of all those distant centuries settle into the past where it belongs, acknowledged and honoured, but no longer present. You're safe, you're warm, the air you breathe is clean, and no invisible enemies lurk in it, waiting to claim you in your sleep. The night outside your window holds nothing more threatening than ordinary darkness, the kind of darkness that gives way to morning as it always has, as it will again tomorrow. The survivors of the Black Death would envy you this peace, this security, this freedom from the fears that haunted their every breath. Honour them by appreciating what you have, by recognising how far humanity has travelled from those desperate years, by carrying their resilience forward into whatever challenges your own time presents. Sleep now, gentle traveller through history. Let the long journey we've taken together conclude in rest, in dreams that hold nothing of plague or death or fear. The medieval world has released you, and tomorrow belongs to the living. And so our story ends, as all stories must, with the quiet settling of consciousness into rest. The images we've conjured together, the crowded medieval streets, the terrifying symptoms, the desperate remedies, the remarkable resilience, all of these can fade now into the soft blur of approaching sleep. Your breathing has perhaps already slowed as we travelled through those centuries. Your body, released from whatever tensions it carried into this evening, has grown heavier against your pillow, more willing to surrender to the gentle pull of rest. This is as it should be. History, for all its weight and significance, serves us best when it helps us understand our present. And your present, right now, is this moment of peaceful transition between waking and dreams. The people we've met tonight, the physicians in their strange costumes, the flagellants in their frantic processions, the caregivers who stayed with the dying, the survivors who rebuilt what had been lost, all of them would recognise what you're experiencing now. Sleep, after all, hasn't changed across the centuries. The same darkness that claimed medieval consciousness each night claims yours, the same restoration awaits, the same quiet miracle of waking renewed. Let your thoughts drift now, unhurried and unworried. If fragments of our journey surface, a beaked mask, a tolling bell, a survivor's face, let them float past without grasping, images passing through your mind like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Tomorrow holds its own concerns, its own opportunities, its own small and large challenges. But tomorrow is not yet here, and this moment belongs entirely to rest. The medieval world has taught us what it can. Now let silence teach you something simpler, that sleep is its own kind of survival, its own small triumph over darkness. Rest well. You've earned it.